I imagine a mountain in winter, tall and silent, draped in powder that catches the light like crushed diamonds scattered across an endless slope. And I think about how snow has always been there, patient, waiting, calling to those who would one day learn to ride it in ways no one had imagined before. The air up here is thin and cold, and when the wind moves through the pines, it carries with it a sound like distant breathing, slow and rhythmic, as if the mountain itself were alive and dreaming. And in that dream there are figures, small against the vastness, tracing lines down the white face of the world, lines that didn't exist 100 years ago, lines that tell a story of innovation and rebellion, of falling and rising, of a sport that began as a whisper and became a roar. I think about the early days when snow was something to endure rather than celebrate, when mountains were barriers instead of playgrounds, and how someone somewhere looked at a hill covered in white and thought, what if I could glide down that, not on two narrow pieces of wood, but on something wider, something that felt more like surfing, more like flight. There's a quality to fresh snow that's hard to describe unless you've stood in it, the way it muffles sound, the way it transforms a landscape into something both familiar and utterly strange. And when you move through it, really move, carving turns and feeling the resistance and release beneath you, it's as though you've entered into a conversation with gravity itself, a negotiation conducted in motion and balance and split-second adjustments. The history of snowboarding is not a straight line. It's more like the tracks left behind on a powder day, wandering and intersecting, doubling back and shooting forward, influenced by surfing and skateboarding and skiing, by iconoclasts who didn't fit into the established order of winter sports, by engineers and dreamers and kids who just wanted to feel what it was like to stand sideways on a hill and let go. I imagine those first boards, crude things really, planks of wood with rope for bindings, no metal edges, no engineered flex patterns, just the raw idea that this could work, that the principles governing surfboards on water might somehow translate to snow, and the failures must have been spectacular, the wipeouts legendary, but something kept pulling them back, some combination of joy and defiance that said this is worth pursuing, this is worth refining. And refine they did, slowly at first, in garages and workshops, using materials scavenged from other sports, from water skis and surfboards, from downhill racers and cross-country planks, experimenting with width and length, with bindings that would hold a boot but still allow movement, with edges that could grip ice and bases that could glide on powder. Each iteration a small step towards something that didn't yet have a name, but was becoming more real with every run down a hill. I think about the resistance they faced, the ski resorts that banned them, the gatekeepers who saw these sideways riders as reckless, as dangerous, as somehow not legitimate, and how that resistance only seemed to fuel the fire, how being told no became part of the identity, how the outsider status attracted exactly the kind of people who would push the sport further, faster, higher, into terrain and tricks that seemed impossible until someone landed them. There's a beauty in watching someone carve, a turn on a snowboard, the way the body leans, trusts, commits, the way the edge bites into the snow, and the board arcs across the fall line, leaving behind a perfect crescent, a signature written in compression and release. And when you see it, you've done well. When you see someone who has truly mastered the physics and the feel, it stops being a sport and start being something closer to art, something that speaks without words about balance and courage, and the strange magic of sliding sideways down a mountain. The story I want to trace is one of evolution, not just of equipment, but of culture, of how a fringe activity became an Olympic sport, of how garage tinkerers became industry giants, of how materials science and design philosophy and rider feedback created boards that would have seemed like science fiction to those early pioneers strapping themselves to wooden planks with inner tube rubber. And so I begin here, at the top of an imaginary run, looking down at the unmarked snow, knowing that the path ahead winds through decades of innovation, through the minds of inventors whose names should be remembered, through competitions that defined styles and legitimized a sport, through the incremental improvements in materials and manufacturing that made boards lighter, stronger, more responsive, more forgiving. The mountain is patient. It has been here longer than any of us, and it will be here long after. But for this moment, in this quiet space between breaths, I'm ready to descend, to follow the thread of this story wherever it leads, through powder and ice, through triumph and setback, through the evolution of something that started as a crazy idea and became a way of life for millions around the world. The story begins long before anyone called it snowboarding, back when the idea was just a flicker, a what if, whispered between friends who spent their winters chasing waves and their summers riding concrete. People who looked at snow-covered hills and saw possibility instead of cold inconvenience. In the early 1960s, a man named Sherman Poppin stood in his backyard in Muskegon, Michigan, watching his daughters try to stand on their sleds, and something clicked in his mind, a connection between their playful attempts and the surfboards he'd seen at the beach. And he went into his garage and bolted two skis together, side by side, creating a wider platform, something you could stand on sideways, something that felt less like skiing and more like surfing on snow. He called it the Snurfer, a portmanteau that captured exactly what it was. Snow and surf merged into one awkward, thrilling, barely controllable piece of equipment, and his daughters loved it, carving wobbly lines down the gentle slope behind their house, shrieking with delight every time they managed to stay upright for more than a few seconds. Poppin's wife suggested he try to sell the idea, and he licensed it to a manufacturing company, and by 1966 they were producing Snurfers commercially, selling them as toys, as Christmas gifts for kids who wanted something more exciting than a traditional sled. And they sold hundreds of thousands of them over the next decade, spreading across the snow belt like a quiet revolution that nobody quite recognized yet. The Snurfer was primitive by any measure, a flat piece of wood, maybe 4 feet long, with a rope attached to the nose that you held for balance. No bindings, no metal edges, no real way to control it except shifting your weight and hoping, and the rope was almost useless. More psychological comfort than actual steering mechanism. But it worked well enough to be fun, and fun was enough to plant seeds. Around the same time, on the other side of the country, another thread was beginning to weave itself into the story. In the mid-1960s, engineers and surf enthusiasts in California were experimenting with their own versions of snow surfing, trying to capture the feeling of riding waves when the ocean went flat or the seasons changed. A man named Tom Sims, barely a teenager, built a ski board in his 7th grade shop class, cutting and shaping wood, trying to create something that would let him practice his surfing moves on snow. And while his teacher gave him a mediocre grade for the project, Sims saw potential, saw a future in the clumsy prototype he'd constructed. Sims kept refining his designs throughout high school and into college, influenced by skateboarding, which was exploding in Southern California, by the aggressive, creative style of skaters who were inventing tricks and pushing boundaries. And he started to imagine snowboards not just as toys, but as legitimate sporting equipment, something that could be manufactured with the same care and precision as surfboards and skateboards. By the early 1970s, both Sims and another inventor named Dmitry Milovich were creating boards that went beyond the snurfer concept. Milovich founded Winterstick, and his boards featured designs influenced by his background in engineering, with wider noses and tapered tails, with attempts at edge control and flex patterns that responded to rider input. Milovich approached snowboard design with almost scientific rigor, studying how water skis and surfboards interacted with their mediums, trying to translate those principles to snow, and his Winterstick boards were beautiful objects, shaped with intention, often featuring elaborate graphics that turned each board into a work of art as much as a piece of sports equipment. But the market was tiny, almost non-existent. Ski resorts wanted nothing to do with these strange sideways riders, and insurance companies saw them as liability nightmares. So the early pioneers rode in secret, hiking up hills that ski patrols didn't monitor, sessioning small slopes where no one cared what you stood on as long as you weren't hurting anyone. The late 1970s brought another crucial figure into the story, Jake Burton Carpenter, who had ridden snurfers as a teenager in New York, falling in love with the sensation despite the equipment's obvious limitations. And when he moved to Vermont in 1977, he started a company in a barn, determined to build better boards that could compete with skis on their own terms. Burton's early boards still resembled snurfers, but he added bindings, actual straps that held your feet in place, giving riders far more control, allowing them to pressure edges to carve real turns instead of just sliding and hoping. And this innovation, simple as it sounds, changed everything about what was possible on a snowboard. The bindings meant you could jump, you could land, you could apply force through your feet into the board and have that force translate into predictable motion. And suddenly, tricks became possible. Aerials, spins, maneuvers borrowed from skateboarding that required the board to stay attached to your feet. And the sport started to split, to develop its own identity separate from skiing, separate even from surfing. Around this same time, in 1979, a snurfer competition was held in Michigan, a gathering of enthusiasts who traveled from around the region to race down a hill to see who could control their boards well enough to navigate a basic course. And Jake Burton showed up with one of his modified boards, the one with bindings. The organizers didn't know what to make of it. His board was clearly different from the toy snurfers everyone else was riding, and there was debate about whether he should even be allowed to compete. But eventually they created a separate category for him, and he raced alone, winning his division by default, but proving that his design worked, that bindings weren't just a gimmick, but a fundamental improvement. That same event attracted another rider who would become legendary. Tom Sims was there, and although Burton and Sims were developing similar ideas independently, this was when their paths began to intersect, to compete, to push each other toward better designs and bolder visions of what snowboarding could become. The early 1980s saw an explosion of small companies, garage operations started by riders who wanted equipment that didn't exist yet, brands like Barfoot, Sims, Burton, Winterstick, each with their own philosophy about what a snowboard should be, how it should flex, how wide it should be, whether it should be symmetrical or directional. Most of these early boards were made of wood, laminated and shaped by hand, with bases made from polyethylene borrowed from ski manufacturing, and metal edges that were hammered and glued into place. The process was labor-intensive, prone to failure, and the boards themselves were heavy, unforgiving, nothing like the refined equipment that would come later. But they worked. They allowed riders to develop styles, to learn what was possible when you committed your weight to an edge, when you used the board's flex to generate speed or absorb impact. And every winter brought new riders into the fold. People who saw someone snowboarding and thought, I want to try that. I want to feel what that feels like. The resistance from ski areas remained fierce. Most mountains banned snowboards outright, claiming they were dangerous, uncontrollable, operated by reckless yahoos who would hurt themselves and others. And there was some truth to this. Early snowboarders were often young, often fearless to the point of foolishness, riding equipment that barely worked on terrain that barely tolerated them. But a few resorts began to see opportunity. Places like Suicide 6 in Vermont and Pando Winter Sports Park in Colorado started allowing snowboarders, recognizing that these outsiders represented a new market, a different demographic than the traditional ski crowd, and the boarders responded with fierce loyalty, returning season after season, spending money on lift tickets and lessons and lodging. In 1982, the first national snowboarding competition was held at Suicide 6. Organized by Paul Graves, who believed the sport needed structure, needed legitimacy, needed to prove it could be more than just kids messing around on glorified sleds, and riders came from across the country, competing in slalom and downhill events, trying to demonstrate control and speed and athletic ability. The competition was rough. The courses were barely groomed. The boards were inconsistent, but it represented a turning point, a moment when snowboarding began to organize itself, to think about rules and standards and what it meant to be good at this strange new sport. Around the same time, snowboard design was evolving rapidly. Manufacturers were experimenting with different materials, trying fiberglass laminates, playing with core constructions that used foam or wood, or combinations of both, attempting to create boards that were lighter but still strong, responsive but forgiving enough for beginners. Tom Sims was incorporating skateboarding aesthetics into his boards, using bright graphics, asymmetrical designs, creating equipment that looked fast even when it was standing still. And his background in the skateboarding influenced not just the look, but the feel. Boards with more pop, more playfulness, designed for tricks as much as for turning. Jake Burton was taking a different approach, focusing on performance, on creating boards that could carve like skis, that could hold an edge on ice, that would appeal to ski resorts and ski instructors who were slowly, reluctantly, beginning to accept that snowboarding might not be a passing fad. The split between these philosophies, freestyle versus alpine, play versus performance, would define much of snowboarding's evolution over the next decade. But in the early 80s, it was all still fun, all still being figured out through trial and error, through riders pushing equipment to failure and then demanding something better. Bindings evolved too. Early strap systems gave way to high backs, rigid supports behind the calf that allowed for more leverage, more control on the heel side edge, and this innovation opened up steeper terrain. Let riders tackle runs that had been too difficult, too icy, too technical for the limited equipment they'd been using. The invention of the high back changed how riders could move on a mountain. Before this innovation, turning heel side meant leaning back and hoping, fighting against the natural tendency to catch an edge and tumble backward into the snow. But with a high back, you could pressure the board, could drive through the turn with intention, and suddenly heel side carving became as powerful as toe side, opening up the full mountain to exploration. I think about the mid-1980s, when snowboarding was still underground but growing, spreading through word of mouth and grainy videos passed between friends, riders filming each other on bulky camcorders, documenting tricks and lines that no one had tried before, creating a visual language for a sport that was inventing itself in real time. The videos mattered more than anyone realized at first. They were proof, evidence that this wasn't just kids sliding around, that real athleticism was happening, that riders were launching off natural features and spinning, grabbing their boards in midair, landing and riding away, and each video pushed the next generation to try something bigger, something no one had captured on film yet. Terry Kidwell emerged as one of the first true innovators of aerial tricks. He approached snowboarding with a skateboarder's mindset, seeing the mountain as a terrain park before terrain parks existed, eyeing every roller and side hit as an opportunity to go airborne. And he invented tricks with names that would become standard vocabulary. The mute grab, where you reach across your body with your front hand to grab the toe side edge, a move that looks effortless when done right but requires perfect timing and body awareness. Kidwell's influence rippled outward. Riders started thinking about snowboarding not just as a way to get down the mountain, but as a medium for expression, for style, for pushing the boundaries of what a human body could do while strapped to a plank of wood and fiberglass. By 1985, roughly 36 ski resorts in North America allowed snowboarding, a small number but growing, and each resort that opened its lifts to boarders became a mecca, a gathering place where riders could meet, could session together, could learn from each other's approaches and techniques. The equipment was improving faster now. Companies were investing in research and development, hiring engineers who understood materials science, who could calculate flex patterns and torsional rigidity, who could design boards that behaved predictably under stress. And the boards started to stratify. You could buy a board designed for racing, narrow and stiff with deep side cut for carving, or you could buy a freestyle board, wider and softer with a twin shape that rode the same forward or backward. This bifurcation reflected the split in snowboarding culture. Some riders wanted legitimacy, wanted to prove they could compete with skiers in speed and technical ability. They entered gates and timed runs. They wore racing suits and studied line choice. They pushed for snowboarding to be recognized as a serious alpine sport. Others wanted freedom, wanted to ride powder and hit jumps and spin off cliffs. They wore baggy clothes and bright colors. They listened to punk and hip-hop. They saw snowboarding as rebellion, as art, as anything but another structured competitive sport with judges and rules. Both camps were right. Both were necessary. The racers gave snowboarding credibility, helped convince resort operators and insurance companies that boarders could control their equipment, that they weren't just reckless. And the freestylers gave snowboarding soul, kept it creative and progressive, prevented it from becoming just skiing turned sideways. In 1987, the first World Snowboarding Championships were held in Breckenridge, Colorado, and the event drew competitors from multiple countries. Riders from Europe and Japan were developing their own scenes, their own approaches to equipment and style, and when they gathered in one place, the cross-pollination of ideas accelerated everything. European riders tended toward alpine technique, precise carving, technical proficiency, while American riders brought a looser, more expressive style influenced by skateboarding's rebellious ethos. And Japanese riders were developing their own aesthetic, meticulous and creative, focused on perfect execution and innovative board graphics. The boards themselves were becoming works of art, each company developing signature visual styles. Sims boards featured bold graphics, often with checkerboard patterns or striking asymmetrical designs. Burton favored cleaner lines, letting the wood grain show through or using understated logos, and smaller companies experimented wildly, creating boards that looked like surfboards or skateboards or abstract paintings. But aesthetics meant nothing if the board didn't perform, and performance came down to understanding how different materials interacted, how a wood core could be combined with fiberglass wraps to create specific flex characteristics, how the base material could be sintered at different temperatures to create varying levels of speed and wax absorption, how metal edges could be shaped and tuned to grip ice without being too catchy in softer snow. The late 80s brought another crucial innovation, the asymmetrical board, developed by riders who recognized that heel side and toe side turns required different things from the board. Your body doesn't move symmetrically when you're strapped in sideways, so why should the board be symmetrical? And designers started creating boards with deeper side cut on one edge, or different flex patterns from heel to toe. These asymmetrical designs were controversial. Some riders swore by them, claimed they made turning easier, more intuitive, while others found them confusing, too specialized, and the market eventually decided that symmetry won for freestyle boards, while directional shapes with different nose and tail characteristics made sense for all mountain and powder riding. Around this time, in 1988, a young rider named Craig Kelly was establishing himself as perhaps the most talented snowboarder in the world. He could race, could win competitions against specialists, but he could also ride powder with a fluidity that seemed impossible, and his smooth, powerful style became the template, the thing other riders tried to emulate. Kelly worked closely with Burton, testing prototypes, providing feedback on flex and shape, and how boards behaved in different snow conditions. And this collaboration between elite riders and manufacturers became standard practice, a feedback loop that drove innovation faster than any single engineer or designer could manage alone. The boards were getting more specialized. Powder boards became wider with setback stances, designed to float in deep snow, to keep the nose up while the tail sank, creating the sensation of surfing through champagne powder. And these boards were revelation in the right conditions, but nearly unrideable on groomed runs or hardpack. Conversely, carving boards were becoming narrower, stiffer, with extreme side cut that allowed for dramatic edge-to-edge transitions, and riders on these boards looked like alpine skiers, laying out huge arcing turns, getting so low their hands touched the snow, feeling G-forces that made your legs burn and your lungs heave. The freestyle boards stayed in the middle, jack-of-all-trades equipment that could handle jumps and rails and general mountain riding, and for most recreational snowboarders, these were the boards that made sense, versatile enough to explore the whole mountain, forgiving enough to be fun even when you weren't riding perfectly. Binding technology was evolving alongside boards. The early strap systems were improving, becoming more adjustable, more comfortable, using materials that stayed flexible even in extreme cold, and companies started thinking about how bindings transferred energy from boot to board, how they could enhance response without being so stiff that they transmitted every vibration and chatter. Some manufacturers experimented with plate bindings, systems borrowed from alpine skiing, where a hard boot clicked into a mechanism mounted on the board. These setups were incredibly responsive, perfect for racing, but they sacrificed the freedom of movement that made snowboarding feel different from skiing, and most riders rejected them, preferred the feel of soft boots and strap bindings, even if it meant giving up some performance. By 1990, snowboarding had reached a tipping point. It was no longer possible to dismiss it as a fad. Too many people were doing it. Too much money was flowing into the industry. Too many resorts were opening their mountains to boarders because the economics made sense. And the ski industry was beginning to panic, wondering if these sideways riders represented an existential threat to skiing itself. The answer was no. Skiing wasn't dying, but snowboarding was capturing the imagination of a younger generation, offering something that felt new and different, less bound by tradition and formality. And ski companies started acquiring snowboard brands or launching their own lines, trying to capture some of that energy, that cultural cachet. Burton remained independent, grew into the industry's dominant force through innovation and marketing, and Jake Burton's relentless focus on legitimizing the sport. But dozens of other companies thrived too, each carving out niches, serving different riders with different needs and preferences. The early 90s brought another wave of innovation, focused on making boards easier to ride. Manufacturers realized that if snowboarding was going to grow beyond the hardcore enthusiast market, they needed equipment that beginners could learn on, boards that were forgiving, that didn't punish every mistake with a harsh fall. This led to softer flexing boards, wider waists for stability, and teaching techniques that emphasized linking turns rather than straight lining down the mountain. And rental fleets at resorts started stocking beginner-appropriate equipment, recognizing that someone's first experience on a snowboard would determine whether they came back or gave up in frustration. Boot technology advanced too. Early snowboard boots were essentially modified winter boots, offering warmth but little support. But as the sport progressed, boots became engineered specifically for snowboarding with flex patterns that supported the ankle but allowed for movement, with lacing systems that could be tightened or loosened to adjust response, with liners that could be heat molded to individual feet. The connection between boot and binding became critical. Too loose, and you lost control. Too tight, and you couldn't move naturally. And riders learned to tune this relationship, adjusting strap tension and high back angles to match their style and the conditions they were riding. I think about standing in a shop in 1992, looking at a wall of snowboards, seeing the diversity of shapes and graphics and promises, each board claiming to be the breakthrough, the innovation that would transform your riding. And while much of it was marketing, there was real progress happening, genuine improvements that made the sport more accessible and more progressive at the same time. Step bindings appeared around this time, systems where you could click your boot in from above without bending down to fasten straps. And while purists scoffed at first, claiming real snowboarders didn't mind strapping in, the convenience won converts, especially among older riders or anyone who got tired of sitting in the snow wrestling with frozen buckles. The mid-90s marked snowboarding's full arrival into mainstream culture. MTV was broadcasting snowboard competitions. Brands like Burton and Sims were appearing in sporting goods stores across the country, and kids who had never seen a mountain were hanging snowboard posters in their bedrooms, drawn to the imagery, the attitude, the promise of freedom that the sport represented. In 1998, snowboarding became an Olympic sport at the Nagano Winter Games, and this moment divided the snowboarding community like nothing before. Some saw Olympic inclusion as validation, proof that snowboarding had earned its place among legitimate winter sports, while others saw it as selling out, as surrendering the rebellious soul of snowboarding to the corporate structures and nationalism of the Olympic movement. The debates were fierce, passionate, because they touched on fundamental questions about what snowboarding was supposed to be, and some of the sport's biggest names refused to participate, stayed away from the Olympics on principle, while others competed and became household names, winning medals that brought snowboarding into living rooms around the world. But regardless of the politics, the equipment continued evolving, and the late 90s brought innovations in board construction that would have seemed like science fiction a decade earlier. Companies started using carbon fiber, aerospace materials that could be precisely laid into boards to control flex and torsion, creating boards that were lighter and more responsive than anything wood and fiberglass alone could achieve. Sandwich construction became standard, layers of different materials pressed together, each contributing specific properties: a wood core for feel and dampening, fiberglass for strength, carbon stringers for snap, rubber dampening layers to absorb vibration, and top sheets that were no longer just decorative but structural, adding stiffness or allowing for specific flex patterns. Cap construction offered an alternative, wrapping the materials around the core and sealing them from above, creating boards that were cheaper to manufacture, more durable at the edges, though often less responsive than sandwich-built boards. And riders had to choose based on their priorities, their budget, their willingness to sacrifice some performance for durability. The boards were getting shorter, too, throughout the 80s and early 90s, Most boards were relatively long, riders choosing boards that came up to somewhere between their chin and nose when stood on end. But as turn technology improved, as side cut became more sophisticated, riders realized they could control shorter boards more easily, could spin them faster, could maneuver through tight terrain. This shift toward shorter boards made snowboarding more accessible, less intimidating, easier to learn, and it changed the style. Riders were doing more spins, more quick transitions, using the mountain as a canvas for increasingly complex tricks and combinations. Terrain parks emerged as dedicated spaces for freestyle riding, resorts building jumps and rails, and boxes specifically for snowboarders and the new generation of twin-tip skiers who were borrowing moves from snowboarding, and these parks became proving grounds, places where progression happened daily, where riders pushed each other to try bigger airs, longer rails, more technical combinations. The jump technology itself evolved. Early jumps were often just piled snow, inconsistent and dangerous. But as parks became more sophisticated, jump builders learned to shape takeoffs and landings with precision, creating features that launched riders at specific angles with predictable pop, allowing for safer progression into aerial tricks. Tabletops became the standard. Jumps where the landing was at the same level as the takeoff, with a flat section in between. So if you came up short, you landed on snow rather than hitting an upslope. And this innovation made parks safer, made it possible to learn without the constant fear of catastrophic injury. Around 2000, another shift began. Riders started exploring backcountry terrain more seriously, hiking beyond resort boundaries to find untracked powder, riding couloirs and spines and faces that had never seen a snowboard before. And this required different equipment: longer boards for stability in variable snow, wider boards for float-in powder, split boards that could be separated and used like skis for ascending, then rejoined for the descent. The split board was a revelation for backcountry access. Invented by a Utah rider named Brett Kobernick in the early 90s, but refined and popularized by companies like Voil through the 2000s. It solved the fundamental problem of how to get into the mountains efficiently. Skis and skins worked perfectly for skiers, but snowboarders had been stuck, either snowshoeing, which was exhausting, or using snowboards with climbing skins, which barely worked. With a split board, you could tour like a skier, making good time on the uphill, accessing terrain that would have taken hours to reach on snowshoes, and then reassemble the board at the top and ride down. And this opened up the backcountry to snowboarders, created a whole new discipline focused on human-powered riding, on earning turns, on experiencing mountains in their wild state. Safety equipment evolved alongside this backcountry movement. Avalanche transceivers became smaller and more reliable. Probe poles and shovels became standard, and riders began taking avalanche education courses, learning to read terrain and snowpack, understanding that powder riding in the backcountry required knowledge and judgment, not just skill and courage. Back at the resorts, board technology kept advancing. Rocker profiles started appearing around 2005, reversing the traditional camber shape where the board arced up in the middle when laid flat. Rocker meant the board contacted the snow under your feet, but curved up at the tip and tail, and this changed everything about how boards felt and performed. Rocker made boards more forgiving, easier to turn, less catchy, and in powder they floated effortlessly, the upturned nose and tail preventing the board from diving, creating a surfy feel that reminded riders why snowboarding had started with surfers and surf-inspired designs in the first place. Hybrid camber profiles followed, boards with rocker between the feet but camber under the bindings, or vice versa. Each combination creating different characteristics, different trade-offs between edge hold and float, between playfulness and stability, and riders could choose profiles based on their home, mountains' typical conditions, their preferred terrain, their riding style. Magnetraction appeared around this time too, serrated edges with multiple contact points instead of one continuous arc, invented by a small company called LibTech, and those edges gripped ice like nothing before, allowed riders to carve confidently on hardpack that would have been sketchy on traditional edges, though some riders found them too catchy, too aggressive for their taste. The 2010s brought 3D base contours, boards that weren't flat from edge to edge but had subtle channels and convex sections, and these shapes changed how boards interacted with snow, how they released from turns, how they floated in powder, each manufacturer developing proprietary base technologies with names that promised revolutionary performance. Volume-shifted designs became popular, shorter, wider boards that maintained float and stability while being easier to maneuver, and riders started choosing boards that came up to their chest or even shoulders instead of their nose, embracing the playfulness and quick edge-to-edge response that shorter lengths provided. Women's specific snowboards finally became standard, not just men's boards with pink graphics, but equipment designed around different weight distributions, different stance widths, different flex patterns that matched how women riders moved and balanced. And this recognition that one size didn't fit all helped grow the sport among women who had been underserved by the industry for decades. Binding technology continued improving. Straps became more ergonomic, conforming to boot shapes, and materials advanced, using plastics that stayed flexible in extreme cold, that didn't crack or become brittle after seasons of use, and the ratchet mechanisms became more reliable, easier to operate with gloves on, less prone to icing up. Boot lacing systems evolved too. Traditional laces gave way to speed lace systems, then BOA dials that tightened internal cables with the twist of a mechanism, allowing for micro-adjustments, for different tension in different zones of the boot. And while some riders preferred the simplicity of traditional laces, others embraced the convenience and customization that newer systems provided. The graphics on boards became more sophisticated, moving beyond simple logos and patterns to complex artwork, collaborations with artists and photographers, limited edition designs that turned snowboards into collectibles, and some riders bought boards as much for how they looked as for how they performed, displaying them as art when they weren't being ridden. By 2010, snowboarding had matured into a multi-billion-dollar industry, with equipment options for every discipline and skill level, from beginner boards that cost a few $100s to handcrafted boutique boards that cost over $1,000, from soft boots for freestyle to stiff boots for alpine carving, from bindings designed for park riding to bindings built for charging steep terrain. The diversity was overwhelming. Walking into a shop meant confronting hundreds of choices, and while this variety meant every rider could find equipment suited to their needs, It also created confusion, paralysis, the tyranny of too many options, and riders had to educate themselves, read reviews, test equipment, trust shop employees who actually rode and understood the nuances. Online communities helped, forums where riders shared experiences with different boards and setups, where they debated the merits of various technologies, where beginners could ask questions and get advice from more experienced riders. And this collective knowledge helped democratize access to information that had once been closely held by industry insiders. The evolution of snowboard equipment reflects broader patterns in how sports develop. Early chaos and experimentation giving way to refinement, to specialization, to the accumulation of knowledge about what works and what doesn't. And yet, even as the industry matured, even as boards became more engineered and scientifically optimized, there remained room for innovation, for small companies with radical ideas, for riders who saw possibilities no one else had considered. I think about how far the equipment has traveled from those first snurfers, from planks of wood with rope handles, to carbon fiber composite boards with base technologies licensed from aerospace research. And yet, the fundamental act remains the same: strapping your feet to a board and sliding down a mountain, feeling the connection between your body and the snow, experiencing speed and control, and the particular joy that comes from dancing with gravity. The progression never really stops. Even now, companies continue researching new materials, new shapes, new ways to make boards lighter or more responsive or more forgiving, and riders continue pushing the boundaries, trying tricks that seem impossible until someone lands them, riding terrain that seems too steep or too technical until someone proves it can be done. And yet, beneath all the innovation and marketing and Olympic medals, beneath the debates about style and the evolution of materials, there remains something essential about snowboarding that transcends equipment altogether. Something that drew those first pioneers to strap planks to their feet and point them downhill. A quality that exists in the space between human intention and mountain indifference, between control and surrender. I think about the physics of it. How a snowboard is really just a lever, your body the fulcrum, and how every turn is a negotiation with forces that existed long before humans. Gravity pulling you down, slope, friction resisting, momentum carrying you forward, and the board is the interface, the tool that translates your subtle weight, shifts into arcing paths through space. When you carve a turn, really carve it, pressing the edge deep into the snow until you feel the board flex and load. There's a moment where you're trusting mathematics you don't consciously understand, trusting that the side cut radius and your speed and the angle of your edge will all combine to bring you through the arc safely. And when it works, when you feel that perfect balance of forces, it's like touching something fundamental about how the universe operates. The sensation of floating through powder is different, but equally profound. There's no hard edge to rely on, just the board planing across the surface of the snow, supported by displaced volume, by speed, by the continuous small adjustments your body makes without thinking. And in those moments, riding untracked snow down a wide open face, you understand why surfers looked at mountains and saw waves, why they wanted to translate that feeling of gliding across a living surface. Snowboarding teaches patience in ways that aren't obvious at first. The patience to wait for the right conditions, for the storm to clear and the snow to settle, for the sun to soften the surface or the temperatures to drop and firm it up, and riders become amateur meteorologists, reading forecasts, understanding how different temperatures and wind patterns create different snow qualities. They learn to read terrain too, to see a slope not just as a descent but as a composition of features. Convex rollers that speed you up and concave compressions that slow you down, wind lips and cornices and terrain transitions where the consequences of a mistake multiply. And this reading becomes intuitive, processed faster than conscious thought, essential for safety and progression alike. There's a meditative quality to riding, especially in the back country where the only sounds are your board cutting through snow and your breathing, and perhaps the wind moving through the trees. Everything else falls away. Work stress and relationship complications and the general noise of being alive. And what remains is just this: the immediate present, the next turn, the quality of the snow beneath your board. The community that formed around snowboarding matters too, the way riders help each other, sharing beta about conditions, offering encouragement when someone's trying a new feature or pushing into steeper terrain, building jumps together, hiking together, understanding that while riding is often solitary, the culture around it is collective, and the progression never stops being satisfying, even after decades. Even when you think you've mastered something, there's always refinement, always the possibility of doing it smoother, more efficiently, with more style. And this endless potential for improvement keeps riders engaged, keeps them coming back to the mountain season after season. The equipment evolution I've traced reflects this same quality, this restless desire to improve, to refine, to find better ways of doing something that was already working. And while some innovations were marketing more than substance, many represented genuine attempts to solve problems, to make boards that floated better or carved harder or forgave mistakes more gracefully. The designers and engineers who dedicated careers to snowboard development were often riders themselves, motivated not just by profit, but by genuine love for the sport, by wanting to create tools that would enable experiences they valued. And their work, accumulating over decades, transformed snowboarding from a fringe activity into something accessible to millions while still maintaining its core identity. I think about the different styles that emerged, the different ways people chose to express themselves on a snowboard. Some riders all about speed and power, laying out huge carves, riding with aggressive intensity. Others focused on technical tricks, on perfect execution of spins and grabs, on pushing the limits of what's possible in a terrain park. Still others preferred the quiet satisfaction of first tracks in powder, of riding untouched snow in the back country, valuing the journey and the landscape as much as the descent. And all these approaches were valid, all part of snowboarding's broad church, united by the basic act of sliding sideways down a mountain. The progression from snurfer to modern snowboard mirrors human innovation in general. We take a simple idea, test it, refine it, add layers of sophistication, and somewhere in that process, the tool becomes transparent, becomes an extension of intention rather than a separate object. And experienced riders don't think about their equipment while riding. They just ride, the board responding to thought as if thought and motion were the same thing. And now, as the narrative begins to settle, as the story of equipment evolution reaches something like a plateau, I find myself thinking not about what comes next in snowboarding technology, but about what remains constant, what endures beneath all the changes. The mountain remains patient, offering itself to each new generation, indifferent to whether they arrive on wood planks or carbon fiber composites, indifferent to their style or skill level, just there, white and silent, waiting. The snow remains, falling in patterns determined by atmospheric physics, accumulating in drifts and cornices, transforming from powder to packed to ice and back again, creating the infinite variety of surfaces that make each run different, each day unique, and the desire remains. The thing that pulled Sherman Poppin into his garage to bolt two skis together, the thing that made Tom Sims build a ski board in shop class, the thing that drives riders to hike for hours to reach untouched terrain, the fundamental human urge to move through space in ways that feel like flight, like freedom, like play. I imagine a young person encountering snowboarding for the first time, strapping into a rental board with no idea what's about to happen, and then feeling it, that first successful turn, the board responding to their weight shift, the snow giving them feedback, and in that moment they're connected to everyone who ever felt this, to all the riders who came before, to the whole lineage of innovation and progression and stubborn refusal to accept that something couldn't be done. The story of snowboarding equipment is really a story about human creativity, about how we solve problems and push boundaries, about how desire and engineering and trial and error combine to create new possibilities. And while I've traced the historical arc, the specific innovations, and the people who made them, what matters more is the pattern, the way progress happens through iteration and feedback, through riders demanding better and builders delivering it. And so the boards continue to evolve. Even now, somewhere a designer is testing a new material, a new shape, trying to create something that performs just a little better, and somewhere a rider is pushing into terrain that seems too steep, too consequential, testing themselves and their equipment against the mountain's indifference. The sun is lower now in my imagination, the shadows longer across the slope, and the mountain is quieter. The lifts have stopped running, the last riders have made their final descents, and what's left is just the snow, the trees, the wind moving through the high places. I think about all the tracks that have been carved into mountains over the past 50 years, millions upon millions of them, each one temporary, erased by new snow or wind or sun. But while they existed, they were evidence, proof that someone was here. Someone moved through this space with intention and skill and joy. And tomorrow there will be new tracks, new riders, some on equipment that would seem magical to those first snurfer pioneers, but all of them participating in the same fundamental act, strapping a board to their feet and surrendering to gravity, letting the mountain pull them downward while they dance with the forces that govern motion and balance. The technology will keep improving. Materials will get lighter and stronger. Designs will get more refined. But the essential experience won't change. Can't change because it's rooted in something deeper than equipment, in the human body's relationship to snow and slope and speed. And perhaps that's the real story. Not the progression from wood to fiberglass to carbon fiber, but the constant beneath the change, the thing that makes someone stand at the top of a run, take a breath, and push off into the fall line, trusting their board and their skill and the mountain's ancient patience. The light is fading now, and the mountain is settling into its evening quiet, and I'm aware of how much ground we've covered, how many innovations and riders and moments of progression, and yet how it all comes back to this snow and slope and the simple human desire to slide. The story continues. It always continues. New riders discovering the sport, new technologies emerging, new styles developing. But for now, in this moment, I'm content to rest here at the end of this long descent through history, knowing that tomorrow the mountain will still be there, still offering itself, still patient, still waiting for the next person who straps on a board and decides to see what's possible. And the tracks will fade, and the snow will fall again, covering everything, making it new. And the cycle will continue as it has, as it will, as long as there are mountains and snow and people who look at a hill and see not an obstacle, but an invitation, not a barrier, but a canvas, not something to avoid, but something to embrace and explore and ride. I imagine a world emerging slowly from shadow, a time when the light fell differently across the land, when the rhythm of days moved to the turning of seasons and the tolling of bells that echoed across valleys still thick with ancient forest. Medieval Europe, a phrase that conjures something distant, something half-remembered, like a dream that lingers just beyond the edge of waking thought. But it was real as stone and earth and the hands that shaped them, as real as the breath of millions who lived and loved and labored beneath skies we would scarcely recognize. The air smells different here, wood smoke curling from 1,000 hearths, the rich dark scent of turned earth in fields that stretch beyond sight, and something else, something harder to name, the mineral tang of quarried stone, the sweet decay of thatch, the intermingling of animals and humans in spaces far more intimate than we might imagine today. I find myself standing at the edge of a village, though village feels too simple a word for what unfolds before me, a cluster of structures that seem to grow from the land itself, timber and daub and wattle woven together with a craft passed down through generations, who never wrote their names, who left no grand monuments, but whose hands shaped every beam and post with patient knowing. The great church rises at the center, not yet the soaring cathedral of later centuries, but solid, present, its thick walls bearing the weight of more than timber and stone, bearing the weight of community and memory and something approaching forever in the minds of those who built it, who would never see its completion, but trusted that their children and their children's children would continue the work. Time moved differently then, or perhaps it's only that we move differently now, rushing, always rushing, while here in this other world, this medieval landscape, there is a quality of patience woven into the very fabric of existence, the patience of the mason who carves a single stone for days, knowing it will fit with 1,000 others he will never touch, the patience of the scribe who copies manuscripts by candlelight, preserving words in languages both living and slowly dying, the patience of the farmer who tends the same strips of land his grandfather tended, trusting the old rotations, the fallow years that let the earth breathe and recover. The light here has a particular quality, softer somehow, filtering through air thick with moisture from endless forests and wetlands not yet drained, through smoke from fires that never fully die, banked each night and coaxed to life each morning, a continuity of flame that connects one day to the next in an unbroken thread. I notice the sounds, or rather the absence of sounds we take for granted. No mechanical hum, no distant traffic, no electrical buzz. Instead, the low of cattle being driven to common pasture, the rhythmic strike of a blacksmith's hammer on anvil, the call of a woman selling bread in the market square, voices rising in plain chant from the church, a weaving of human and animal and natural sound that creates its own kind of music. The world is smaller here, and yet somehow larger. Smaller because most people will never travel more than a day's walk from where they were born, because news arrives slowly, carried by travelers and merchants and the occasional herald, because the known world extends only as far as rumor and imagination, and yet larger because each place contains multitudes, because a single manor or monastery might hold all the complexity of the governance and craft and spiritual yearning that we now scatter across cities. I think of the 1,000 years we call medieval, though those who lived them knew no such name. They did not think of themselves as a middle or between. They were simply present, living in what they understood as the fullness of time, in a world that had always been and would always be, or so it seemed until the slow accumulation of changes, barely perceptible in a single lifetime, began to shift the very foundations of how humans organized themselves and understood their place in creation, from the ruins of Rome's Western Empire, from the migrations and settlements and slow blendings of peoples, from the spread of Christian monasticism and the adaptation of older traditions. Something new took shape, something we can only see clearly from this great distance, something that seemed eternal to those within it, and yet was always, always in the process of becoming. The evening draws closer, the light growing thicker, more golden, and I find myself drawn deeper into this landscape, ready to wander through the centuries that stretch ahead, through the kingdoms and villages and monasteries, through the minds and hearts of people who seem so distant, and yet, in their fundamental humanness, in their capacity for wonder and cruelty and tenderness and fear, are perhaps not so different from those who would come after. The story begins not with a single moment, but with a slow unraveling, the gradual dissolution of an empire that had seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves. Rome, that word which had meant order and roads and law stretching from Britain to the deserts of Africa, began to contract, to pull back, like a tide that would never return. In the year 410, a date that would echo through centuries, the Visigoths entered Rome, not as visitors or supplicants, but as conquerors. And though the city had long since ceased to be the true center of imperial power, the symbolic weight of this moment rippled outward, a signal that the old certainties were crumbling, that the world was entering a time of transformation so profound that those living through it could scarcely comprehend the magnitude of change. But the end of Rome was not the end of everything. This is crucial to understand. The people did not vanish. The knowledge did not simply disappear into darkness. Instead, a long, slow process of adaptation began. A blending of Roman provincial culture with the customs and structures of the Germanic peoples who had been moving settling, integrating themselves into the fabric of the empire for generations. In Gaul, in Hispania, in Britain, and along the Rhine and Danube, new kingdoms emerged, led by warriors who had served in Roman armies, who had learned Latin and adopted Roman titles, who married into Roman families and converted to Christianity, creating something hybrid, something that carried forward elements of the old world, even as it forged new patterns of authority and belonging. The Frankish kingdoms rose in what had been Gaul, built by the Merovingian dynasty, whose origins blend history and legend in equal measure. King Clovis, whose name we might render as Louis in later centuries, united the Frankish tribes in the late 5th and early 6th centuries, and his conversion to Catholic Christianity rather than the Arian Christianity of many Germanic peoples created an alliance between Frankish military power and the Roman ecclesiastical structure that would shape the future of Western Europe. The Church became the vessel that carried Roman learning forward. Monasteries scattered across the landscape like islands of literacy in a world where reading and writing were becoming rare and specialized skills. Monks copied manuscripts, preserved texts, maintained the calendar, kept records, and in doing so, created networks of knowledge and communication that transcended the fragmentary political boundaries of the early medieval world. In Italy, the situation grew more complex still. The Ostrogoths established a kingdom that tried to maintain Roman administrative structures, their king Theodoric ruling from Ravenna, attempting to balance Gothic military culture with Roman civilian governance, but this fragile arrangement collapsed in the mid-6th century when the Byzantine Empire, the eastern remnant of Rome that had never fallen, launched a campaign to reconquer the West. The Gothic wars that followed devastated the Italian peninsula, decades of fighting that left cities depopulated, aqueducts broken, the countryside ravaged, and when the Byzantines finally achieved a hollow victory, they lacked the resources to truly restore what had been lost. And within a generation, a new Germanic people, the Lombards, swept down from the north, establishing their own kingdom in northern and central Italy, fragmenting the peninsula into a patchwork that would persist for over 1,000 years. Britain followed its own trajectory, more isolated, more completely severed from the Mediterranean world. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that emerged there after the Roman withdrawal developed with less direct continuity from the Roman past, their language and culture drawing more heavily from their Germanic roots, though Christianity would eventually arrive, brought by missionaries from both Rome and the Celtic monasteries of Ireland, creating new connections to the broader Christian world. In Hispania, the Visigothic kingdom established itself, eventually converting from Arian to Catholic Christianity in the late 6th century, creating a realm that blended Roman law and Gothic military tradition, a kingdom that seemed stable and enduring until the early 8th century would bring dramatic and unexpected transformation. Ireland, never conquered by Rome, developed its own distinctive form of medieval culture, Celtic Christianity flowering in monasteries that became centers of learning and artistry, producing illuminated manuscripts of breathtaking beauty, sending missionaries back to Britain and across to the continent, contributing to the gradual Christianization and cultural development of the post-Roman world. The 7th century brought new challenges and new energies. In the Arabian Peninsula, a religious and political movement erupted that would reshape the Mediterranean world. Islam, spreading with remarkable speed through the Middle East, across North Africa, and in 711, across the Straits of Gibraltar into Hispania, the Visigothic kingdom collapsed in a matter of years, and a new reality emerged, Al-Andalus, a Muslim polity in Western Europe that would become a center of learning and culture, while Christian kingdoms persisted in the mountainous north, beginning the long, slow process of the Reconquista that would take centuries to complete. The arrival of Islam in the Western Mediterranean transformed trade patterns, cultural exchanges, and the political landscape. It also contributed to a drawing apart of the Mediterranean world. The sea that had been Rome's Mare Nostrum, our sea, became a frontier, a border between realms that would have limited but significant contact, exchanges of goods and ideas, and occasionally hostilities, but no longer the unified space it had been. In the Frankish kingdoms, a new dynasty rose to power, the Carolingians, who began as mayors of the palace, administrators for increasingly weak Merovingian kings, until finally, in 751, Pepin the Short claimed the throne with papal blessing, creating a new alliance between the Frankish monarchy and the papacy that would define much of medieval European politics. Pepin's son would be remembered as Charles the Great, Charlemagne, who in the late 8th and early 9th centuries created an empire that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, from the North Sea to Rome, a realm larger than any in Western Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire. He was crowned emperor by the Pope on Christmas Day in the year 800, a symbolic moment that attempted to revive the idea of a Christian Roman Empire in the West, though the reality was something quite different from what Rome had been. The Carolingian Renaissance brought renewed attention to learning, to classical texts, to education. Charlemagne gathered scholars from across Europe to his court, mandated the establishment of schools, standardized religious practice, encouraged the copying of manuscripts in a new clear script, Carolingian minuscule, that would influence European handwriting for centuries. This was not a restoration of classical culture, but an adaptation, a Christian reworking of selected elements of the Roman past. The monasteries expanded their role during this period, becoming not just centers of prayer and manuscript production, but also agricultural innovators, managing vast estates, developing new techniques for cultivation and animal husbandry, creating surplus that supported not just the monastic communities themselves, but also schools and hospitals and charity for the poor. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, became the dominant framework for monastic life in Western Europe. Its carefully balanced schedule of prayer and work and study, its moderate approach to asceticism, its emphasis on stability and obedience and community, created institutions that could endure across generations, that could accumulate wealth and knowledge and influence. But the Carolingian Empire could not hold. The centrifugal forces were too strong, the administrative structures too weak, the custom of dividing realms among sons too deeply ingrained, and after Charlemagne's death, and the brief reign of his son Louis the Pious, the empire fractured, divided by the Treaty of Verdun in 843 into 3 kingdoms that roughly prefigured the later divisions between France and Germany and Italy, though the boundaries would shift endlessly in the centuries to come. The 9th and 10th centuries brought new waves of invasion and disruption. From the north, the Vikings, Norse seafarers and raiders who struck with devastating speed, their shallow draft ships allowing them to penetrate deep into river systems, raiding monasteries and towns, eventually settling and establishing their own territories, the Danelaw in England, Normandy in Francia, creating new cultural blendings and political arrangements. From the east, the Magyars, mounted warriors from the steppes, raided deep into Central Europe and Italy until finally defeated and converted to Christianity, establishing the Kingdom of Hungary, another addition to the complex mosaic of medieval European polities. From the south, Saracen raiders from North Africa struck at coastal settlements in Italy and southern Francia, creating insecurity that pushed settlement inland, that encouraged the building of fortifications, the development of local defense structures that would contribute to the fragmentation of political authority. These invasions, these disruptions, accelerated changes that were already underway, the breakdown of centralized authority, the rise of local strongmen who could offer protection in exchange for service and loyalty, the development of what later scholars would call feudalism, though that word itself is contested, a shorthand for complex and variable arrangements of land tenure and military obligation and personal bonds that differed significantly from place to place and time to time. The castle began to appear across the landscape, at first simple wooden structures on earthen mounds, motte and bailey fortifications that could be erected quickly, later evolving into more permanent stone structures. These were not just military installations, they were centers of lordship, symbols of authority, residences from which local lords administered justice and collected rents and organized the labor of the surrounding countryside. The year 1000 approached, and though apocalyptic fears were likely less widespread than later legends would suggest, there was nevertheless a sense of time deepening, of the world acquiring age and weight. The early medieval period, the age of migrations and invasions and fragmentation, was giving way to something new, to a period of relative stability and growth, to a flourishing of culture and economy and political organization that would characterize the high medieval period. But that transformation, that flowering, belongs to another chapter of this long, slow story. The 11th century dawned with a new energy, a quickening of life that manifested in stone and parchment and the steady expansion of cultivated land. The population was growing, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum, and with this growth came new possibilities, new complexities, new forms of organization that would define what historians call the High Middle Ages. The landscape itself was being transformed. Forests that had stood since time immemorial fell to the axe. Marshes were drained. New villages appeared in clearings. The great work of internal colonization as people pushed into marginal lands, bringing them under cultivation, extending the reach of human settlement and agriculture into spaces that had been wild. This was not conquest in the military sense, but a slower, more patient kind of expansion, the conquest of nature through labor. The technology of farming evolved, the heavy plow with its iron blade and wheels, capable of turning the dense soils of northern Europe, became more widespread. The three-field system replaced older two-field rotations in many regions, allowing more intensive use of the land. One field in winter grain, one in spring grain, one lying fallow, a rhythm that increased yields and supported large larger populations, the horse collar, a seemingly simple innovation, transformed agricultural labor, allowing horses to pull plows and carts without the choking effect of older harness designs. Horses were faster than oxen, could work longer hours, and their use spread gradually across the countryside, changing the pace and productivity of rural life. Mills multiplied along rivers and streams, water wheels turning grinding stones, converting grain to flour with mechanical power rather than human muscle. These mills became markers of lordship, monopolies that peasants were required to use, paying fees that enriched the lords who controlled them. But they also represented a harnessing of natural forces, an application of engineering knowledge that increased efficiency and freed human labor for other tasks. The monasteries continued their expansion, new orders emerged, each with its own interpretation of how the religious life should be lived. The Cluniacs emphasized elaborate liturgy and independence from local secular control, their mother house at Cluny becoming the center of a network of dependent priories that stretched across Europe. Their church rebuilt in the late 11th century to be the largest in Christendom, a statement of spiritual ambition rendered in stone. The Cistercians represented a different vision, a return to stricter observance of the Benedictine rule. They sought out remote locations, cleared land, built their austere churches without decoration or ornament, developed expertise in agriculture and especially sheep farming, their white-robed monks becoming masters of estate management, creating economic enterprises that accumulated vast wealth even as they preached poverty and simplicity. Towns began to grow. Old Roman settlements reawakened. New market centers emerged at crossroads and river crossings. These were not yet the great cities of later centuries, but their appearance marked a significant shift, a revival of urban life in regions where it had nearly disappeared. Walls went up. Guilds formed. Merchants and artisans organized themselves into communities with their own customs and privileges, negotiating charters from lords and kings that granted them degrees of self-governance. The growth of towns created new social categories, people who were neither nobles nor peasants nor clergy, burghers, townspeople whose wealth came from trade and craft rather than land, whose loyalty was to their community rather than to a personal lord. This unsettled older categories created tensions and opportunities, added new layers to the social fabric. Trade expanded along rivers and roads and sea routes. The Mediterranean came alive with Italian merchants, Venice and Genoa and Pisa competing for dominance, establishing trading posts in the Byzantine Empire and the Crusader states, bringing Eastern goods, spices and silk and precious metals to Western markets, growing wealthy on the margins of exchange. In the north, the Baltic, that became a zone of intensive commerce. German merchants formed the Hanseatic League, a confederation of trading cities that dominated commerce from Novgorod to London, their cogs, sturdy sailing ships with high sides, carried timber and furs and amber and grain, linking the northern world in networks of exchange. The fairs of Champagne became meeting points where northern and southern trade routes intersected. Merchants from across Europe gathered at designated times and places, exchanging goods, settling accounts, developing the financial instruments, letters of credit and bills of exchange that allowed commerce to operate across great distances without the need to transport heavy coins. The castle evolved from simple wooden structures to elaborate stone fortifications. The Norman keep, square and solid, rising multiple stories with thick walls and small windows, designed to withstand siege. These were expensive to build, requiring skilled masons and years of labor. Their presence on the landscape declared the power and permanence of those who built them. The cathedral became the defining architectural achievement of the age. The Romanesque style of the 11th and early 12th centuries, with its round arches and massive pillars and barrel vaults, created spaces of profound solidity, churches that seemed to anchor earth to heaven through sheer weight of stone. Durham, Spire, Santiago de Compostela, each a masterwork of engineering and devotion. Then, in the mid-12th century, a new style emerged from the Ile-de-France, what later ages would call Gothic, pointed arches and ribbed vaults and flying buttresses, innovations that allowed walls to rise higher and thinner, that permitted the insertion of vast windows filled with colored glass, transforming the interior into spaces of colored light. Abbot Suger at Saint-Denis articulated a theology of light, the divine made manifest through radiance and beauty, and this vision spread. Chartres, Notre-Dame de Paris, Amiens, Cologne, Salisbury, each pushing the limits of what stone and glass could achieve. These cathedrals took generations to complete, entire lifetimes spent cutting stone and laying foundations, carving capitals and corbels, mixing mortar and hoisting blocks into place. The names of most workers are lost to us, anonymous craftsmen whose skill created beauty that would endure for centuries. But the buildings themselves stand as testimony to their mastery, to the patient accumulation of knowledge about structure and proportion, and the behavior of materials under stress. The universities emerged in the 12th and 13th centuries. Bologna, Paris, Oxford, Cambridge. Communities of masters and students organized to pursue learning, initially focused on theology and law and medicine and the liberal arts, the 7 traditional disciplines inherited from antiquity: grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, music, the foundation of medieval education, the recovery of Aristotle's works, transmitted through Arabic translations and commentaries, revolutionized medieval thought. Suddenly there was access to a comprehensive philosophical system, a way of understanding the natural world through reason and observation. This created both opportunity and crisis. How to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology? How to integrate pagan learning with revealed truth? Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century attempted a grand synthesis, the Summa Theologicae, an encyclopedic work that engaged with every major theological and philosophical question, using Aristotelian methods to elaborate and defend Christian doctrine, creating an intellectual edifice as ambitious in its own way as the Gothic cathedrals were in theirs. The scholastic method dominated university education. Formal disputations where questions were posed, arguments and counter-arguments presented, authorities cited, distinctions drawn. This could seem dry and overly subtle to later critics, but it represented a serious effort to think systematically, to test ideas through rigorous questioning, to build knowledge through careful reasoning. The Crusades shaped this period profoundly. In 1095, Pope Urban II called for an armed pilgrimage to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim rule. The response exceeded all expectations. Thousands took the cross, motivated by piety and hope for salvation, by dreams of adventure and land, by poverty and desperation. The First Crusade succeeded against considerable odds, establishing crusader states in the Levant that would persist for nearly 2 centuries. Subsequent crusades had mixed results. Some ended in disaster. The Fourth Crusade infamously diverted to Constantinople, sacking the Christian Byzantine capital in 1204, a catastrophe that deepened the schism between Eastern and Western Christianity and fatally weakened the Byzantine Empire. But the crusading movement persisted, becoming a permanent feature of European culture, shaping ideas about holy war and religious identity, about the relationship between Christianity and Islam. The Crusades also facilitated cultural exchange. European knights and merchants spent time in the East, encountered different technologies and ideas, returned with new tastes for sugar and cotton and architectural innovations. This was not peaceful exchange. It occurred in the context of warfare and conquest, but it nevertheless contributed to the transmission of knowledge and techniques between the Islamic world and Christian Europe. The Reconquista in Iberia continued throughout this period, Christian kingdoms slowly expanding southward, capturing Toledo in 1085, a major symbolic and practical victory that brought Arabic manuscripts and Jewish scholars into the Christian world, creating conditions for translation movements that made Greek and Arabic learning available in Latin. Spain became a crucial zone of contact and transmission, where the 3 Abrahamic faiths coexisted uneasily, sometimes in cooperation, sometimes in conflict, always in complex relationship. The Jewish communities scattered across medieval Europe occupied a distinctive position, excluded from many occupations, barred from owning land in most places. They often specialized in commerce and money lending, activities that Christian teaching complicated for Christians themselves. This made them valuable to rulers who needed financial services, but also vulnerable to persecution and scapegoating, especially during times of crisis or religious fervor. The 12th century witnessed a flowering of Jewish scholarship, rabbinical academies in the Rhineland and Spain and southern France produced commentaries and legal texts and philosophy. Maimonides, physician and philosopher, attempted his own synthesis of Aristotelian thought and Jewish theology, creating works that influenced Christian and Islamic thinkers as well as Jewish ones. Women in this medieval world occupied complex positions. Legal status varied by region and social class. Noble women could wield considerable power, managing estates in their husband's absence, arranging marriages, patronizing religious foundations. Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was Queen of France and then England, participated directly in politics and governance, supporting her sons in rebellion against her husband, riding on crusade, living to see her grandchildren positioned across the thrones of Europe. Peasant women worked alongside men in fields and gardens, managed households, performed the endless labor of food preparation and textile production, spinning and weaving and sewing that clothed their families and generated surplus for trade or rent. Their work was essential, though rarely recorded, their names mostly lost, except in scattered manor records and court rolls. Religious women found space for autonomy in convents and nunneries. Abbesses governed their own communities, managed properties, exercised spiritual authority. Mystics like Hildegard of Bingen wrote theology and natural philosophy, composed music, corresponded with popes and emperors, carved out space for female intellectual and creative life within structures that generally subordinated women to male authority. The 13th century represented perhaps the apex of medieval civilization. The population reached levels it would not attain again until the modern era. Agricultural production was high. Trade networks functioned efficiently. The universities flourished. The great cathedrals neared completion. Powerful monarchies in France and England developed increasingly sophisticated administrative systems. The papacy exercised extensive authority over the church and claimed supremacy over secular rulers. It seemed as though this world had achieved a kind of equilibrium, a stable order that might endure indefinitely, but already, in ways not yet visible, the seeds of transformation were present, waiting for conditions that would allow them to germinate. The 14th century opened with signs of strain. The climate was shifting, imperceptibly at first, but with cumulative effect. The medieval warm period that had allowed cultivation of marginal lands and supported population growth was giving way to cooler, wetter conditions. Harvests failed more frequently. Famines struck with devastating regularity. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 killed perhaps 10% of the population in Northern Europe, a catastrophe that revealed the fragility underlying apparent prosperity. The population had reached the limits of what medieval agricultural technology could support. Too many people on land that was increasingly exhausted, forests cleared too completely, soils depleted by centuries of cultivation without adequate fertilization. The expansion that had characterized the previous centuries slowed, stopped, began to reverse. Villages were abandoned. Marginal lands reverted to wilderness. The great internal colonization was over. Political tensions escalated. The 100 Years' War began in 1337, a dynastic conflict between England and France that would drag on intermittently for over a century, devastating the French countryside, draining treasuries, killing nobles and peasants alike in battles and sieges and the brutal chevauchée, the mounted raids that burned villages and destroyed crops to undermine enemy resources. The nature of warfare was changing. At Crécy in 1346, English longbowmen slaughtered French cavalry. Repeating the performance at Poitiers a decade later, the flower of French chivalry, knights who had trained their entire lives for mounted combat fell to commoners armed with simple wooden bows. This was more than military defeat. It was symbolic, suggesting that the old order, the dominance of the mounted warrior, might not be as secure as it seemed. Then came the pestilence. In 1347, reports began to filter westward from the Black Sea. A terrible disease was spreading, killing with horrifying speed and completeness. By 1348, it had reached Italy. By 1349, it was in England and Scandinavia. The Black Death, likely bubonic plague, though some historians debate the precise pathogen, killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's population in the space of a few years. The scale of death defied comprehension. Entire villages disappeared. Monasteries lost all their inhabitants. Cities became charnel houses. The living could barely bury the dead. Mass graves, bodies stacked in layers. The social fabric tore under the strain. Some turned to frantic piety. flagellants whipping themselves in public processions, seeking to appease divine wrath, others to scapegoating, pogroms against Jewish communities accused of poisoning wells, massacres that revealed the depths of hatred and fear. The plague returned in waves throughout the late 14th and 15th centuries, never again with the catastrophic mortality of the first outbreak, but sufficient to prevent population recovery, to maintain a demographic depression that fundamentally altered the economic and social landscape. Labor became scarce and therefore valuable. Peasants could demand better terms, higher wages, more freedom. Lords who had depended on abundant cheap labor found their authority challenged. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 saw tens of thousands march on London, demanding an end to serfdom, the repeal of oppressive laws. They were ultimately defeated, their leaders executed, but the underlying economic forces could not be reversed by violence. Serfdom gradually weakened, commuted to money rents, as lords found it more practical to hire free laborers than to compel service from legally bound peasants. The church faced its own crisis of authority. The papacy had moved to Avignon in 1309, remaining there for nearly 70 years under French influence when it finally returned to Rome. A disputed papal election in 1378 resulted in rival popes, one in Rome, one in Avignon, each claiming legitimacy, each excommunicating the other's supporters. The Great Schism persisted for decades, resolved only by the Council of Constance in the early 15th century. But the damage to papal prestige was profound and lasting. Critics of the Church grew bolder. John Wycliffe in England questioned papal authority, argued for scripture in the vernacular, challenged transubstantiation. His followers, the Lollards, persisted despite persecution in Bohemia. Jan Hus drew on Wycliffe's ideas, adding his own critique of church wealth and corruption. He was burned as a heretic in 1415, but his movement sparked wars that ravaged Central Europe for decades. These were harbingers of the Protestant Reformation that would come a century later. Yet even as the 14th century brought crisis and death, it also saw remarkable cultural achievements. Dante wrote the Divine Comedy in the early 14th century, creating Italian literature as a serious artistic medium. Petrarch and Boccaccio followed, developing new forms and styles that influenced writers across Europe. The vernacular languages were coming into their own, no longer merely spoken dialects, but vehicles for sophisticated literary expression. In painting, Giotto broke with the flat, stylized figures of medieval art, creating forms with weight and volume, placing them in convincing spatial settings. His frescoes in Padua and Florence suggested a new way of seeing, of representing the world with attention to naturalistic detail and human emotion. This was not yet the full flowering of Renaissance art, but the seeds were being planted. The universities continued to function, though sometimes disrupted by plague or war. New institutions were founded, Prague in 1348, Heidelberg in 1386, a proliferation of centers of learning across Europe. The curriculum remained traditional, but within that framework, debates continued about free will and determinism, about the nature of universals, about logic and language and how knowledge is possible. Technological innovation continued. Mechanical clocks began to appear in churches and town squares in the 14th century, marking hours with mechanical precision rather than the approximate divisions of the day based on bells and sun position. This seems minor, but it represented a shift in consciousness, a new way of experiencing time as something measurable, divisible, commodifiable. Gunpowder arrived from China by the 14th century. Cannon were being used in sieges, primitive at first, dangerous to operators, but steadily improving. By the 15th century, artillery could breach walls that had been impregnable to traditional siege weapons. The great castles and fortifications of the medieval period became obsolete, requiring complete reimagining of defensive architecture. Bastions and angular walls designed to deflect cannon shot rather than high curtain walls meant to resist ladders and siege towers. The printing press arrived in the mid-15th century. Johannes Gutenberg in Mainz, developing movable type that made possible the relatively rapid production of books. The first major work was a Bible, printed in the 1450s. Beautiful enough to compete with manuscript books, but producible in quantities that would have required an army of scribes. Within decades, printing presses spread across Europe, and the cost of books began to fall, slowly making reading material accessible to broader audiences. The 100 Years' War finally ground to a close in the mid-15th century, France ultimately victorious. England expelled from all continental possessions except Calais, but immediately England descended into its own civil conflict. The Wars of the Roses, noble factions fighting for the throne, eliminating each other with remarkable thoroughness, until finally Henry Tudor defeated Richard III at Bosworth Field in 1485, establishing a new dynasty. The medieval period in England was effectively over, though no one at the time would have used that term. The Byzantine Empire, that eastern remnant of Rome that had survived while the West fragmented, finally fell in 1453. Constantinople captured by the Ottoman Turks after a siege that saw the last use of Greek fire and the first major deployment of a massive siege cannon. The great walls that had protected the city for over 1,000 years were breached. The emperor died fighting in the streets, and a direct link to the ancient world was severed. Greek scholars fled west, bringing manuscripts and knowledge, contributing to the revival of classical learning that was already underway in Italy. The Italian Renaissance was in full flower by the 15th century, though Renaissance itself is a later construction. Those living through it experienced it as a revival, a rebirth of ancient excellence. Brunelleschi studying Roman buildings to understand dome construction, creating the great cupola of Florence Cathedral, Donatello sculpting figures that seemed alive, standing with classical contrapposto, Botticelli, painting mythological subjects with a grace and beauty that drew on both classical and Christian traditions. Humanism as an intellectual movement emphasized the study of classical texts, grammar and rhetoric and moral philosophy, the Studia Humanitatis. This was not a rejection of Christianity, but a different emphasis, attention to this world and human achievement alongside concern for salvation. Many humanists were devout, but their devotion expressed itself differently than the scholastic theology of the universities, more literary, more concerned with eloquence and moral example than with logical demonstration. The voyages of exploration began. Portuguese navigators pushing down the African coast, seeking a sea route to the spices of the East. By 1488, Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope a decade later. Vasco da Gama reached India, establishing direct maritime trade that bypassed the Mediterranean intermediaries who had dominated the spice trade, and in 1492, Columbus sailing for Spain, seeking a western route to Asia, instead encountered the Americas, a discovery that would transform the world in ways no one could have anticipated. These voyages were made possible by medieval innovations, the compass, improved ship designs, better maps and navigational techniques, knowledge accumulated over centuries of Mediterranean and Baltic sailing, applied now to oceanic voyages, pushing beyond the known world into seas that medieval maps had left blank or filled with monsters and speculation. The medieval world was not ending all at once. No trumpet sounded to mark its passing, but the 15th century saw a convergence of changes, demographic, economic, technological, cultural, political, that together constitute a profound transformation. The structures and assumptions that had organized European life for centuries were being challenged, modified, sometimes abandoned. New possibilities emerged, new ways of organizing society, new forms of knowledge and expression, new connections across previously unimaginable distances. Standing at the end of the 15th century, looking back across the medieval millennium, the journey seems immense, from the ruins of Rome to the threshold of a global expansion, from manuscript culture to print, from fragmented kingdoms to emerging nation-states, from Romanesque solidity to Gothic transcendence to Renaissance humanism, 1,000 years of human striving, of faith and doubt, of beauty and brutality, of patient craft and sudden violence, of continuity and change braided together in patterns that still shape the world we inhabit. And yet, beneath the grand movements of kingdoms and churches and plagues, beneath the rise and fall of dynasties and the construction of cathedrals, there were the lives, countless individual lives, each one a universe of experience and feeling. Peasants who never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace, who nevertheless knew the intricacies of their land with an intimacy we can barely imagine, who could read weather in the behavior of birds and clouds, who understood the rhythms of growth and decay with a knowledge earned through generations of observation. There were the craftsmen, the carpenters, who could judge timber by touch and smell, who knew which trees grew straight and which would warp, who understood the language of grain and knot, the potters who centered clay on wheels turned by foot, whose hands remembered forms passed down through apprenticeship, muscle memory that connected them to makers stretching back centuries, the weavers whose fingers flew across looms, creating patterns that carried meanings, symbols of protection or prosperity woven into the fabric of everyday life. There were the travelers, the merchants who learned multiple languages out of necessity, who developed sophisticated mental arithmetic to convert currencies and calculate profits across different systems of weights and measures, who carried news and gossip along with their goods, connecting distant places through their journeys, the pilgrims walking to Santiago or Canterbury or Rome or Jerusalem, seeking healing or forgiveness or simply something beyond the confines of their ordinary existence. There were the children, growing up in worlds we can only partially reconstruct, learning through watching and imitating, beginning work, young, sometimes very young, but also playing games that appear in manuscript margins, tag and ball games and games with dolls and toy weapons, experiencing childhood in ways both utterly different from modern experience and yet recognizably human, the same delight in movement and imagination, the same need for affection and security. There were the elderly, those who survived past the high mortality of youth and middle age, who carried memory of earlier times, who provided continuity and counsel, whose experience of plague or famine or war informed community decisions, whose stories transmitted knowledge and values and identity across generations, human libraries in a world where most people could not read. There were moments of transcendence woven into the fabric of ordinary life, the elevation of the host during Mass, that instant when bread and wine became body and blood, when the finite touched the infinite, when peasants and lords alike knelt before mystery, the singing of Compline in a monastery as darkness fell, voices rising in unison, plain song that had been sung the same way for centuries, creating continuity through sound, connecting the present moment to all the moments that had come before and all that would come after. There were the illuminated manuscripts, monks spending months on a single page, grinding pigments from minerals and plants, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan for the deep blues, gold leaf applied with patient precision, creating images of such beauty that they seemed to glow with inner light. These were not mere decorations. They were theology rendered visible. Attempts to make the divine present through color and form, prayers offered in pigment and gold. There were the cathedral builders, understanding mathematics through practice rather than theory, using simple tools, plumb lines and measuring rods and compasses to create structures of breathtaking complexity. The master masons, who held knowledge of proportion and stress in their minds, who could envision how a building would stand before a single stone was laid, who worked in a tradition that valued the accumulated wisdom of the craft over individual innovation, yet who also pushed boundaries, made each cathedral unique, a dialogue between tradition and creativity. There were the seasons, experienced with an intensity hard to imagine in our climate-controlled world. Winter that could mean genuine hardship, cold that penetrated to the bone, darkness that dominated the day, the precious hoarding of light and warmth, and then spring, the overwhelming relief of lengthening days, of green returning to the world, of animals bearing young, festivals that celebrated survival and renewal with genuine joy born of genuine fear overcome. There were the sounds, the bells that structured time and space, calling to prayer, marking hours, warning of danger, celebrating festivals, their tones carrying across valleys, each bell with its own voice recognized by those who lived within range, the sounds of animals ever present, cattle and sheep and pigs and chickens, horses and dogs, the human voice raised in song or prayer or argument, the clang of metal on metal, the creak of the cartwheels and mill wheels, a soundscape rich and varied and utterly different from the mechanical hum that would come later. There were the smells, bread baking, beer brewing, animals in close quarters, human bodies that bathed infrequently, wood smoke that permeated everything, the sweet decay of thatch, the sharp tang of the newly cut timber, incense in churches, the complex odors of tanneries and dye works, each place with its own olfactory signature, contributing to a sense of identity and belonging. There were the tastes, simple foods, elevated by hunger and by genuine scarcity of alternatives. Bread that was the staff of life, varied in quality, from the fine white bread of the wealthy to the coarse dark bread of peasants, but always central. Pottage, the eternal stew that simmered over fires, vegetables and grains and occasional meat, flavored with herbs from the garden, beer and ale as daily beverages, safer than water and providing calories and nutrition, wine for those who could afford it or who lived where vines grew. There were the textures, wool against skin, coarse or fine, depending on status and wealth, linen for those who could afford it, the smoothness of polished wood, the cool solidity of stone, the rough weave of hemp rope, the soft resistance of clay before firing, the resistance of iron under the hammer, each material with its own qualities, its own possibilities and limitations, known intimately by those who worked with it daily. There were hierarchies, intricate and deeply felt, but also more fluid than sometimes imagined. Serfs who became free, merchants who bought land and married into nobility, younger sons of nobles who entered the church and rose through ability and connections, women who found power through religious life or widowhood. The system was constraining, often brutally so, but it was not completely static, and people navigated it with the same complexity and agency that humans bring to any social order. There were beliefs that ordered the cosmos, heaven above, hell below, earth as the theater where salvation or damnation was decided, a world alive with spiritual presences, angels and demons, saints whose intercession could be sought, relics that carried power, a sacramental universe where the material and spiritual interpenetrated, where nothing was merely physical. Everything carried potential meaning. Everything could point toward or away from the divine. And there was beauty, deliberate and accidental. The rose window at Chartres, light transformed into color and pattern, speaking of order and radiance, the songs of troubadours, love elevated to art, desire transmuted into poetry, the decorated initials in manuscripts, playful and profound, monks allowing humor and observation to intrude into sacred texts, marginal figures that reveal the vitality and strangeness of medieval imagination, rabbits hunting hunters, foxes preaching to geese, the world turned upside down in the borders of the page. The medieval world was not, as sometimes imagined, merely a bridge between classical antiquity and the modern world, a dark interval to be endured and overcome. It was its own time, with its own achievements and failures, its own ways of being human, its own answers to the fundamental questions of how to live, how to organize society, how to seek meaning, how to create beauty, how to face suffering and death, how to hope. The people of medieval Europe were not simpler than us. Their minds worked the same way ours do, capable of the same range of thought and feeling. They were constrained by different material conditions, possessed different knowledge, held different beliefs, but they were fully human, loving and hating, creating and destroying, hoping and despairing, finding joy in small things and wrestling with large questions, building lives of meaning within the circumstances they inherited and the choices they made. To look back at medieval Europe is not to find a lost golden age. There was too much suffering, too much violence, too much inequality and injustice for nostalgia. But neither is it to find only darkness and ignorance. There was too much beauty, too much intellectual achievement, too much human flourishing despite limitations. The truth lies in holding both together, acknowledging the full complexity of a civilization that lasted 1,000 years and shaped the trajectory of the world that followed. The stones remain, cathedrals and castles, abbeys and bridges, weathered by centuries but still standing, still capable of inspiring wonder. The manuscripts survive in libraries, their pages turned carefully by scholars, their illuminations still radiant. The ideas persist, transformed and adapted, but traceable. Threads running from medieval thought into our own time. Debates about authority and freedom, about faith and reason, about justice and power, questions that each generation must answer anew. And perhaps that is what remains most valuable. Not specific answers, not particular institutions or beliefs, but the reminder that humans have always grappled with how to live well, how to create meaning, how to organize communities, how to seek truth and beauty, that the medieval world was one long experiment in human possibility, neither wholly successful nor wholly failed, but simply human, a testament to what people can build and imagine and endure, to the resilience and creativity and fallibility that define our species. The light fades now across the imagined landscape of medieval Europe. The bells ring vespers, the last time before darkness falls, in villages and monasteries and cathedral towns, marking the boundary between day and night, between labor and rest. The cycle continues, as it has always continued, generations rising and falling like waves, each leaving its mark, its contributions and its ruins, its gifts and its burdens for those who come after. The fires are banked, the work of the day finished, bread set to rise for tomorrow, animals settled for the night. The rhythm of life that has sustained humanity through all its ages, in all its forms, continues, adapting, persisting, carrying forward the accumulated wisdom and folly of all who came before. And in the stillness, in the gathering dark, there is a kind of peace, the peace of work completed, of community maintained, of traditions honored, of mysteries contemplated, the peace of knowing one's place in a story much larger than any individual life, a story that stretches back to the beginning and forward to an end none can see, but all are part of. The medieval world recedes, becomes memory, becomes history, becomes story. And in becoming story, it remains accessible to imagination, available for contemplation, 1,000 years condensed into images and ideas, fragments and monuments, texts and traditions, inviting us to wonder, to question, to remember that other ways of being human have existed, other answers have been tried, other beauties created, other challenges faced. The darkness is complete now. The stars emerge, the same stars that shone on medieval Europe, on all the people we have imagined, whose lives we have briefly inhabited. They looked up at these stars and wondered, as we wonder, as humans have always wondered, seeking pattern and meaning in the wheeling heavens, telling stories to make sense of existence, reaching toward transcendence even while rooted in the earth. And in that reaching, in that wondering, in that storytelling, the connection holds across centuries and continents and cultures, the thread of human consciousness, aware and questioning and creating, finding beauty in unexpected places, making meaning from chaos, building and destroying and building again. The endless work of being human continues, has always continued, will continue, long after we too have become memory, become history, become part of the story we leave for those who come after, fading now, gently, like light at dusk, like breath becoming still, like a story finding its ending, its natural rest, its quiet close. There is a world that exists just beyond the edge of what the eye can see, a realm so small that 1,000,000 of its structures could rest on the head of a pin. And in this invisible landscape, in this territory measured in billionths of a meter, something extraordinary unfolds. The nanoscale, a dimension where atoms dance and molecules arrange themselves into patterns of astonishing complexity, where the familiar laws of the everyday world begin to bend and shift, revealing properties that seem almost magical in their strangeness. Imagine standing at the threshold of perception, peering down through layer after layer of magnification, past the grain of sand, past the living cell, past even the tiniest bacteria, until matter itself begins to reveal its most intimate architecture. This is where nanotechnology lives, in the spaces between what we know and what we are only beginning to understand. The word itself carries a kind of music. Nano, from the Greek word for dwarf, meaning 1/billionth, a scale so diminutive that it challenges the imagination. Yet it is here, in this realm of the infinitesimal, that some of the most profound transformations of our time are taking place. To speak of a nanometer is to speak of a measurement almost beyond comprehension. 1/billionth of a meter, roughly the width of 3 or 4 atoms placed side by side. A human hair, by comparison, stretches about 80,000 nanometers across. A red blood cell measures some 7,000 nanometers in diameter, and a single strand of DNA, that elegant spiral staircase that carries the blueprint of life, is only about 2 nanometers wide. At this scale, matter behaves differently. Gold, which appears lustrous and yellow in the world we inhabit, can take on hues of red or purple when crafted into nanoparticles. Materials that are opaque can become transparent. Substances that conduct electricity in bulk form may become insulators, or vice versa. The rules change, and in that changing, new possibilities emerge. The story of nanotechnology is not merely a story of making things smaller, though that is part of it. It is a story of discovering that smallness itself unlocks new properties, new behaviors, new ways of interacting with the physical world. It is the realization that when we work at the scale of individual molecules and atoms, we can engineer matter with a precision that borders on the miraculous. Long before the term nanotechnology entered our vocabulary, nature had already mastered this domain. The lotus leaf, for instance, repels water through nanoscale structures on its surface, creating what scientists would later call the lotus effect. The wings of certain butterflies shimmer with iridescent colors produced not by pigments, but by nanoscale architectures that bend and scatter light in precise ways. Even the gecko's remarkable ability to walk up walls comes from millions of nanoscale hairs on its feet, each one creating a weak molecular attraction that, when multiplied, grants astonishing adhesive power. These examples from the natural world whisper of what becomes possible when structure is controlled at the molecular level, and humanity, in its endless curiosity, has learned to listen. The journey into this small world required new tools, new ways of seeing, because at the nanoscale, ordinary microscopes fail. Light itself, with its wavelengths measured in hundreds of nanometers, cannot resolve features smaller than its own waves. It would be like trying to feel the texture of silk while wearing thick winter gloves. So new instruments were imagined and built, devices that could sense the atomic landscape through other means, scanning tunneling microscopes that measure quantum tunneling currents between a sharp probe and a surface, atomic force microscopes that trace topography by feeling the push and pull of atomic forces. These technologies opened a window into a world that had always existed but had remained hidden, waiting. And what was seen through that window transformed everything. The realization dawned that atoms and molecules could be not just observed, but manipulated, arranged, designed, that materials could be built from the bottom up, one atom at a time if necessary, with intention and purpose. This is where the story truly begins, in the meeting place between human ingenuity and the fundamental building blocks of matter, in laboratories and research centers, in moments of insight and years of patient experimentation, in the gradual understanding that the very small could have very large implications for medicine, for electronics, for energy, for the way we understand and interact with the material world. The air in such places hums with a particular kind of quiet intensity. The controlled environments where contamination must be measured in particles per cubic meter. The clean rooms where a single speck of dust would be a mountain. The instruments that vibrate at frequencies imperceptible to human senses, isolating themselves from the tremors of passing footsteps, from the distant rumble of traffic, from anything that might disturb the delicate work of positioning atoms. Here, in these spaces, the future takes shape one molecule at a time, invisible to the naked eye, but profound in its potential. The earliest whispers of this possibility, the first inklings that matter might be controlled at the atomic scale, emerged not from a laboratory but from a lecture hall on a December evening in 1959, when a physicist named Richard Feynman stood before an audience at the California Institute of Technology and delivered a talk with a title both simple and provocative. There's plenty of room at the bottom. Feynman, with his characteristic playfulness and intellectual daring, asked his audience to imagine writing the entire Encyclopedia Britannica on the head of a pin, to consider storing all the world's books in a pamphlet, to envision machines building smaller machines, which would build smaller machines still, descending in scale until individual atoms could be placed with the precision of a typesetter arranging letters on a page. At the time, this vision seemed like science fiction, a charming thought experiment from a brilliant mind. But Feynman was proposing something more concrete. He was suggesting that the laws of physics did not forbid such manipulation, that there was no fundamental barrier preventing humanity from rearranging matter at the molecular level, that the limitations were merely technological, not physical. He spoke of biological systems, of the cell's ability to manufacture complex proteins by reading genetic instructions, of nature's own nanotechnology operating within every living thing. And he wondered aloud why humanity could not learn to do the same, to build molecular machines, to write information at atomic densities, to manufacture materials with atomic precision. The lecture concluded with two challenges, two prizes offered for achievements that seemed fantastical. One for creating an electric motor no larger than 1/64 of an inch on each side, another for writing text small enough that the entire page of a book could be reduced by a factor of 25,000 in linear scale. The first prize was claimed within months. The second took several more years, but both fell to human ingenuity far sooner than many expected. Yet Feynman's talk, though prescient, did not immediately spark a revolution. It was a seed planted in soil that would need decades to become fertile. The tools did not yet exist. The understanding was incomplete. The vision waited. Through the 1960s and 70s, other streams of thought began to flow toward the same destination. Materials scientists explored the strange properties of very small particles. Chemists synthesized molecules of increasing complexity. Physicists probed the quantum mechanical behavior of nanoscale systems, each discipline moving in its own direction, not yet seeing how the paths would converge. In 1974, a Japanese scientist named Norio Taniguchi used the term nanotechnology for the first time, defining it as the processing of materials by 1 nanometer or less. He was working on precision machining, on the challenge of creating surfaces smooth and precise at scales smaller than ever before achieved. His work was practical, focused on manufacturing and tolerances, on the incremental refinement of existing techniques. But the term he coined would come to mean something larger, something more ambitious. The true transformation began with the invention of new eyes, new ways of perceiving the atomic world. In 1981, at IBM's research laboratory in Zurich, two scientists named Gerd Binnig and Heinrich Rohrer created an instrument unlike any that had come before, the scanning tunneling microscope. This device worked on a principle both elegant and strange. A sharp metal tip, tapered to end in a single atom, was brought so close to a surface that electrons could tunnel between them, a quantum mechanical effect, where particles pass through barriers that classical physics says they cannot cross. By measuring this tunneling current as the tip scanned across a surface, the microscope could map the positions of individual atoms. For the first time in human history, atoms were not merely theoretical constructs or statistical averages. They were visible, countable, real in a way they had never been before. The images produced by the scanning tunneling microscope showed surfaces as landscapes of atomic bumps and valleys, each peak representing a single atom, each contour revealing the underlying structure of matter. Binnig and Rohrer's invention earned them the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1986. But more than that, it opened a door. If atoms could be seen, then perhaps they could be touched, moved, arranged. Just a few years after the scanning tunneling microscope's invention, another instrument joined the toolkit, the atomic force microscope, developed by Binnig along with Calvin Quate and Christoph Gerber. This device measured not electron tunneling, but the tiny forces between atoms using a cantilever, a microscopic diving board with a sharp tip that would bend ever so slightly in response to atomic attractions and repulsions. The atomic force microscope had an advantage. It could work on any material, not just conducting surfaces. It could operate in air, in liquid, in varied environments, and it too could resolve individual atoms, feeling the topography of matter with extraordinary delicacy. These tools transformed nanotechnology from speculation into experimental science. Researchers could now explore the nanoscale directly, mapping surfaces, measuring forces, understanding how matter behaved when confined to dimensions of just a few atoms. And in 1989, a group of scientists at IBM's Almaden Research Center in California demonstrated something that captured imaginations worldwide. They used a scanning tunneling microscope not just to image atoms, but to move them, positioning 35 individual xenon atoms on a nickel surface to spell out the letters IBM, each atom placed with deliberate precision, each one coaxed into position by the microscope's tip. The image became iconic, proof that atomic manipulation was possible, that Feynman's vision of arranging atoms like a typesetter arranging letters was not fantasy but achievable reality. The photograph showed 3 letters formed from glowing dots, each dot a single atom, resting on a surface imaged at a temperature just a few degrees above absolute zero. This was not yet nanotechnology as it would come to be practiced. The work required extreme cold, ultra-high vacuum, hours of painstaking effort to move a handful of atoms. But it was a beginning, a demonstration of principle that would inspire a generation. Around the same time, the concept of nanotechnology was being elaborated in another direction through the visionary and controversial writings of K. Eric Drexler, an engineer and futurist who had studied with pioneers of space systems and molecular biology. Drexler began publishing papers and books that imagined a future of molecular manufacturing, of assemblers that could build virtually anything by arranging atoms in precise patterns. His 1986 book, Engines of Creation, painted a picture both utopian and unsettling. Nanoscale machines that could repair cells, manufacture materials with perfect precision, clean up pollution, even reverse aging, but also machines that could replicate uncontrollably. The famous gray goo scenario, where self-replicating nanobots consume all matter. A nightmare of unintended consequences. Drexler's ideas were speculative, far beyond what any laboratory had achieved, and they sparked intense debate. Some scientists embraced the vision, others criticized it as impossible or dangerously misleading. Arguments erupted over what was physically feasible, over whether molecular assemblers could ever work as Drexler imagined, over whether the promises were premature and the warnings overblown. Yet even amid controversy, Drexler's work served a purpose. It made people think. It raised questions about what nanotechnology could become, about the profound implications of molecular control, about the need for foresight and responsibility as these capabilities developed. It brought nanotechnology into public consciousness, for better and worse, as a field of both extraordinary promise and potential peril. Meanwhile, in laboratories around the world, more modest but tangible progress continued. Chemists synthesized fullerenes, soccer ball-shaped molecules of 60 carbon atoms, discovered accidentally in 1985 and recognized with a Nobel Prize in 1996. These buckyballs, as they came to be called, were purely nanoscale objects, molecular cages with unusual properties, able to trap other atoms inside them, strong yet hollow. Shortly after, carbon nanotubes were identified, cylindrical structures formed by rolling sheets of graphene. These tubes, just a few nanometers in diameter but potentially millimeters long, proved to have remarkable characteristics: stronger than steel, excellent conductors of electricity and heat, lightweight and flexible. They became one of nanotechnology's most studied materials. a building block that seemed to promise countless applications. The late 1980s and early 1990s saw nanotechnology coalesce as a field. Conferences were organized, journals were founded, research groups formed, universities began offering courses, funding agencies started directing resources toward nanoscale science and engineering. What had been scattered insights and isolated experiments began to organize into a discipline, one that drew on physics, chemistry, biology, materials, science, engineering, all converging on this realm of the very small. Governments took notice, recognizing that control of matter at the nanoscale could transform industries, create new economies, shift the balance of technological power. In the United States, the National Nanotechnology Initiative was launched in the year 2000, coordinating research across federal agencies, directing billions of dollars toward fundamental science and technology development. Other nations followed: Japan, European countries, and later China, all investing heavily in nanoscale research, all seeking to position themselves at the forefront of what many believed would be the next industrial revolution. The early years were characterized by exploration, by learning the rules of this unfamiliar territory. Researchers discovered that materials behaved differently at the nanoscale, not as anomalies, but as a matter of course. Quantum effects became important. Surface area relative to volume increased dramatically. Changing chemical reactivity, optical properties, mechanical strength, electrical conductivity, all could be tuned by controlling size and structure. Gold nanoparticles, for instance, could appear red or purple or blue, depending on their size, because the electrons on their surface oscillate collectively when struck by light, a phenomenon called plasmon resonance. And the frequency of that oscillation, the color produced, depends on the particle's dimensions. This meant that color could be engineered at the nanoscale, not through dyes or pigments, but through structure alone. Similarly, titanium dioxide, a white pigment in bulk form, becomes transparent at the nanoscale, but retains its ability to absorb ultraviolet light, making it useful in sunscreens that don't leave a white residue. Zinc oxide, another UV blocker, behaves the same way. These were among the first commercial applications, modest perhaps, but they demonstrated that nanotechnology could move from laboratory curiosity to everyday product. The foundations were being laid, the tools were improving, the understanding was deepening, and the community of researchers was growing, all preparing the ground for what would come next, for the flowering of applications, for the realization of some promises and the recalibration of others, for the movement of nanotechnology from its pioneering phase into something more mature, more complex, more interwoven with the fabric of modern technology and medicine. But that part of the story was still unfolding, still ahead, waiting in the quiet hum of laboratories where invisible architectures were being built, atom by atom, molecule by molecule. The laboratories where this work proceeded had a quality of controlled stillness, spaces designed to eliminate the tremors and vibrations that plague precision at the nanoscale, buildings constructed on foundations isolated from the surrounding earth, floors floating on pneumatic cushions, rooms wrapped in layers of acoustic dampening, all to create an environment where a microscope's probe could be positioned with atomic accuracy. Inside these clean rooms, The air itself was manufactured, filtered thousands of times per hour to remove particles. Each breath of atmosphere passing through membranes with pores measured in fractions of a micron, because at the nanoscale, a single speck of dust would be a boulder, a stray fiber from clothing would be a fallen tree. Contamination had to be measured not just in parts per million, but in particles per cubic foot, and the standard was exacting. Class 10 clean rooms allowed no more than 10 particles larger than the half a micron in each cubic foot of air. Researchers entering these spaces underwent transformation rituals, donning suits that covered every surface of skin, hoods and face masks, gloves, shoe covers. The garments themselves were woven from continuous filament polyester, because regular fabric sheds particles with every movement. Even breathing required care, each exhalation potentially releasing moisture and biological contaminants. So the air people breathed out was directed away from sensitive work areas through carefully designed ventilation systems. The work proceeded in this rarefied environment with a patience that bordered on meditative, because manipulating matter at the nanoscale could not be rushed, could not be forced. It required alignment with the fundamental rhythms of atomic interactions, the delicate touch of forces measured in piconewtons, the awareness that quantum mechanics governed every outcome. As the first decade of the 21st century unfolded, nanotechnology began to diversify into distinct streams, each following its own logic, pursuing its own applications, yet all drawing from the same wellspring of nanoscale understanding. In materials science, researchers learned to create nanocomposites, materials that blended nanoparticles or nanostructures into conventional matrices. Adding tiny amounts of carbon nanotubes to polymers could increase strength dramatically. Incorporating nanoscale clay particles could reduce permeability to gases, making better barriers for packaging. Mixing quantum dots into materials could create displays with more vivid colors. Each innovation relying on the principle that nanoscale additives could transform bulk properties in ways that larger particles never could. The sporting goods industry became an early adopter. Tennis rackets reinforced with carbon nanotubes appeared on professional courts, lighter and stronger than their predecessors. Golf clubs, bicycle frames, hockey sticks, all began incorporating nanomaterials. The performance gains were measured in percentages, but at elite levels of competition, those percentages mattered, and the materials trickled down from professional equipment to consumer products. In electronics, nanotechnology was becoming essential. The semiconductor industry had been shrinking transistors for decades, following what was called Moore's Law, the observation that the number of transistors on a chip doubled approximately every 2 years. But as features shrank below 100 nanometers, then 50, then smaller still, the industry crossed fully into the nanoscale realm, and quantum effects that had once been negligible became central challenges to overcome. Engineers learned to work with these quantum phenomena rather than fight them. Gate oxides in transistors thinned to just a few nanometers, so thin that electrons could tunnel through them, a problem that required new materials. Hafnium-based compounds replaced silicon dioxide. Maintaining insulation at atomic scale thicknesses, interconnects between transistors shrank until copper atoms could migrate under the stress of current flow, necessitating barrier layers measured in single-digit nanometers. Each generation of chips required new innovations at the nanoscale. Photolithography, the process of patterning features on silicon wafers, pushed toward ever shorter wavelengths of light, from deep ultraviolet to extreme ultraviolet, light with wavelengths of just 13.5 nanometers, to pattern features smaller than the light itself through complex interference effects. The machines that produced these chips became marvels of precision engineering, costing hundreds of millions of dollars each, containing optics polished to atomic smoothness, aligned to tolerances measured in picometers. Meanwhile, in the realm of medicine, nanotechnology opened entirely new approaches to diagnosis and treatment. Researchers developed nanoparticles that could circulate through the bloodstream, seeking out cancer cells. The particles were engineered with exquisite specificity, their surfaces decorated with molecules that recognized markers on tumor cells, antibodies or peptides that would bind selectively, ignoring healthy tissue. Once attached to cancer cells, these nanoparticles could serve multiple purposes. Some carried chemotherapy drugs, delivering them directly to tumors while sparing healthy tissue from systemic exposure. Others absorbed specific wavelengths of light, infrared or near-infrared, that could penetrate tissue, and when illuminated, they heated up, raising the temperature of the cancer cells they were attached to, cooking them selectively while leaving surrounding tissue unharmed, a technique called photothermal therapy. Still, other nanoparticles were designed for imaging, quantum dots. Nanoscale semiconductors could be tuned to fluoresce in specific colors based on their size, allowing doctors to track multiple biological processes simultaneously, each marked with a different color. Superparamagnetic iron oxide nanoparticles enhanced MRI scans, accumulating in certain tissues and creating contrast that revealed abnormalities invisible in conventional imaging. The challenge with medical nanoparticles was not just reaching the target, but avoiding removal by the body's defenses. The immune system had evolved to clear foreign particles from the bloodstream, and bare nanoparticles would be consumed by macrophages within minutes. Researchers learned to coat particles with polyethylene glycol, a flexible polymer that created a stealth shield, preventing proteins from binding to the surface, allowing the nanoparticles to circulate for hours, long enough to accumulate in tumors through the enhanced permeability that leaky tumor vasculature provided. In energy applications, nanotechnology promised improvements in both generation and storage. Solar cells enhanced with quantum dots could potentially harvest a broader spectrum of sunlight. Perovskite solar cells, materials with nanoscale crystal structures, achieved rapidly improving efficiencies through the 2010s, rising from single digits to over 20% in less than a decade. Though stability remained a challenge, the materials degraded when exposed to moisture, requiring protective encapsulation. Battery technology advanced through nanoscale engineering. Lithium-ion batteries improved as electrode materials were nanostructured, creating more surface area for reactions, allowing faster charging. Silicon, which could theoretically store much more lithium than the graphite conventionally used, had always suffered from expansion during charging, swelling up to 300%, which fractured the material. But silicon nanoparticles or nanowires could accommodate this expansion, bending rather than breaking, enabling new generations of batteries with higher capacity. Catalysis. The acceleration of chemical reactions was revolutionized by nanoscale metals. Gold, which is famously unreactive in bulk form, becomes an excellent catalyst when formed into nanoparticles. The increased surface area and the quantum effects at small sizes combine to make it active for oxidation reactions. Platinum nanoparticles enabled fuel cells, facilitating the conversion of hydrogen and oxygen to water while generating electricity. Every effort was made to maximize the surface area of platinum, to use as little of the expensive metal as possible while maintaining catalytic activity. Environmental applications emerged. Nanoparticles of zero-valent iron could be injected into groundwater to remediate contamination. The particles would react with chlorinated solvents or heavy metals, breaking them down or immobilizing them. Titanium dioxide nanoparticles, when illuminated with ultraviolet light, could break down organic pollutants through photocatalysis, generating reactive oxygen species that oxidized contaminants. This self-cleaning property was incorporated into coatings for buildings and windows, surfaces that could break down dirt and grime when exposed to sunlight. Water filtration benefited from nanoscale membranes, pores sized to exclude bacteria and viruses while allowing water to pass. Carbon nanotube membranes promised exceptional flow rates combined with selective filtering. Graphene oxide membranes could sieve out salt ions, potentially revolutionizing desalination if they could be manufactured at scale. The challenge was always scalability. Moving from laboratory demonstrations to industrial production, from filtering milliliters to filtering millions of liters, textiles incorporated nanoparticles for various effects. Silver nanoparticles provided antimicrobial properties, killing bacteria and preventing odor in athletic outerwear and medical garments. Silica nanoparticles created superhydrophobic surfaces, fabrics that water would beat up and roll off, leaving no trace. Inspired by the lotus leaf effect that nature had perfected, zinc oxide nanoparticles added UV protection to outdoor clothing, blocking harmful radiation while remaining invisible. Food packaging evolved with nanomaterials, barrier films that kept oxygen and moisture out more effectively, extending shelf life. Some packages incorporated nanosensors that could detect spoilage, changing color when food went bad. Nanoparticles of silver were added to cutting boards and food storage containers for antimicrobial effects, though concerns about silver migration into food led to regulatory scrutiny. And here, the story of nanotechnology intersected with questions of safety, of unintended consequences, because materials that behave differently at the nanoscale might also interact with biological systems in unexpected ways. Nanoparticles could potentially cross barriers that larger particles could not. The blood-brain barrier, the cellular membrane, the nuclear envelope. Their small size and high reactivity raised questions about toxicity, about environmental persistence, about how they would move through ecosystems if released. Studies began to examine these questions. Some nanoparticles showed concerning effects. Carbon nanotubes, with their fiber-like shape, raised worries about asbestos-like behavior in lungs. Certain metal oxide nanoparticles generated reactive oxygen species that damaged cells. Others appeared benign, or their effects depended critically on coating, on surface chemistry, on size distribution. The field of nanotoxicology emerged, attempting to understand the rules, to predict which nanomaterials would be safe and which would pose risks. Regulatory frameworks struggled to keep pace. Existing chemical regulations were based on bulk properties, but nanomaterials could have the same chemical composition as bulk materials while behaving entirely differently. Was titanium dioxide at the nanoscale the same substance as bulk, titanium dioxide, for regulatory purposes? Or was it something new that required separate evaluation? Had different jurisdictions answered differently, creating a patchwork of approaches? Public perception of nanotechnology oscillated between enthusiasm and anxiety. Polls showed that most people knew little about the field, but those who did tended toward either optimism about benefits or concern about risks. Science fiction had primed imaginations with scenarios both utopian and dystopian, from medical nanobots that could cure any disease to gray goo scenarios of runaway replication. And while scientists tried to communicate that reality was more nuanced, more incremental, the vivid narratives of fiction often proved more memorable. Through all of this, the work continued in laboratories, in pilot production facilities, in the quiet spaces where fundamental understanding deepened. Researchers mapped the phase diagrams of nanomaterials, determining how properties changed with size, with shape, with surface chemistry. They developed new synthesis methods, learning to control nucleation and growth with increasing precision to produce uniform particles, to create complex core shell structures, to functionalize surfaces with molecular precision. Characterization techniques multiplied. Transmission electron microscopy revealed internal structures. X-ray diffraction determined crystal phases. Dynamic light scattering measured size distributions. Spectroscopy of various kinds probed electronic and vibrational states, each tool adding a piece to the puzzle of understanding what existed at the nanoscale and how it behaved. The community grew. Journals proliferated. Conferences attracted thousands. Students trained in nanoscience and nanoengineering graduated and joined companies, started ventures, continued research. A whole ecosystem developed. Suppliers of specialized materials and equipment, service providers offering characterization and testing, consultants helping industry navigate the technical and regulatory landscape. And the applications kept expanding, touching more industries, solving more problems, each success building confidence, each challenge revealing complexity. The story was far from over. It was deepening, becoming more intricate, weaving itself into the fabric of technology and society in ways both visible and invisible. As the second decade of the 21st century progressed, nanotechnology began to move beyond its pioneering phase, maturing into something more integrated, more routine, less a revolutionary frontier, and more a set of established tools and techniques woven into the fabric of materials science and engineering. The breathless predictions of the early years, the talk of molecular assemblers and nanobots, receded somewhat, replaced by a more measured understanding of what nanotechnology could accomplish and on what timeline. The transformations were real, but they arrived incrementally, through steady refinement rather than sudden breakthrough, through patient optimization of materials and processes rather than science fiction made manifest. In commercial products, nanotechnology became ubiquitous, yet often invisible. Incorporated into formulations and manufacturing processes without fanfare, the average person might use dozens of products containing nanomaterials in a typical day without knowing it. the sunscreen that absorbed UV radiation without leaving white streaks, the stain-resistant fabric of a jacket, the high-efficiency catalyst in a car's exhaust system, the phosphors in an LED screen, the reinforced polymer in a smartphone case. This invisibility was perhaps inevitable. As nanotechnology succeeded, it disappeared into the background, became normalized, no longer something to announce or market explicitly, but simply part of how things were made. The same trajectory followed by countless technologies before it, from synthetic dyes to transistors, from revolutionary novelty to unremarkable infrastructure. The semiconductor industry continued its relentless march towards smaller features. Transistors with gate lengths of 7 nanometers entered production, then 5. The numbers became almost abstract, designations that no longer corresponded literally to physical dimensions but to performance equivalents. A 7 nanometer node might have some features larger than 7 nanometers and others smaller. The nomenclature had become a marketing metric as much as a technical one. At these scales, every aspect of a chip manufacturing operated in the nanoscale realm. The lithography masks were nanoscale artifacts, the etch processes controlled with atomic precision, the deposition of thin films measured in monolayers. Entire chips could contain billions of transistors, each one a nanoscale device, all operating in concert, processing information at speeds that would have seemed impossible just decades earlier. Yet even here, limits were appearing, not the fundamental limits that physics might impose, but practical limits of cost and complexity. Each new generation of manufacturing equipment became exponentially more expensive. The extreme ultraviolet lithography machines required to pattern the smallest features cost hundreds of millions of dollars each, operated by companies that could be counted on one hand. The barrier to entry had become insurmountable for all but the largest corporations and most advanced economies. And so the industry began to shift, looking not just at making things smaller, but at new architectures, three-dimensional stacking of chips, new materials like gallium nitride or silicon carbide for power electronics, photonic interconnects using light instead of electrons, quantum dots for displays, each innovation drawing on nanoscale understanding but applying it in new configurations. In medicine, the early promise of targeted drug delivery began to bear fruit in approved therapies. Liposomal formulations of chemotherapy drugs reached the market, nanoparticles of albumin carrying paclitaxel, nanoscale iron oxide for treating anemia. These were not the molecular machines of speculative fiction, but they were proof that nanoscale engineering could improve treatment, could reduce side effects, could make existing drugs more effective. Cancer treatment in particular became a focus because tumors had properties that nanomedicine could exploit. Their leaky vasculature allowed nanoparticles to accumulate preferentially, a phenomenon called the enhanced permeability and retention effect. Particles between 10 and 100 nanometers could extravasate from tumor blood vessels and remain trapped in the tumor microenvironment, while being too large to escape normal vasculature. This passive targeting provided a baseline improvement, and when combined with active targeting through surface molecules that recognized tumor markers, the selectivity improved further, clinical trials multiplied, testing nanoparticles for diagnostics and therapy. Some succeeded, many did not. The translation from animal models to humans proved challenging. What worked in mice did not always work in people. The immune system's response to nanoparticles was more complex than initially appreciated. The protein corona, a layer of proteins that adsorb to nanoparticle surfaces within seconds of entering the bloodstream, could alter targeting and clearance in unpredictable ways. Researchers learned humility, recognized that biology was more intricate than the models had suggested, that each type of nanoparticle, each coating, each surface chemistry, would behave slightly differently, that personalized medicine might require personalized nanoparticles tuned to an individual patient's biology, a challenge of complexity that would take years to unravel. In energy storage, the improvements from nanomaterials accumulated. Lithium-ion batteries in electric vehicles benefited from nanostructured electrodes. Silicon nanowires, or nanoparticles mixed with graphite, allowing for higher energy density without the catastrophic failure that bulk silicon experienced. Separator membranes with nanoscale pores improved safety by preventing dendrite formation, the growth of lithium fingers that could short-circuit cells and cause fires, supercapacitors, devices that stored energy through charge separation rather than chemical reactions, advanced through nanomaterials with enormous surface area, graphene, activated carbon, metal oxides, materials where nearly every atom was at the surface, accessible for charge storage. These devices could charge and discharge much faster than batteries, thousands of cycles without degradation, but stored less total energy. They found applications where rapid power delivery mattered, in regenerative braking systems, in grid stabilization, in complementing batteries rather than replacing them. Solar energy conversion explored new frontiers at the nanoscale. Quantum dots could theoretically harvest hot electrons before they lost energy as heat, potentially exceeding the Shockley-Queisser limit that capped the efficiency of conventional solar cells. Perovskite solar cells, with their nanoscale crystal structure and unusual electronic properties, achieved efficiencies rivaling silicon while potentially offering cheaper manufacturing. But stability remained the persistent challenge. The materials degraded with exposure to moisture, to oxygen, to heat, to light itself, and encapsulation helped, but added cost and complexity. Photocatalytic water splitting, using sunlight to generate hydrogen fuel from water, became an area of intense research. Titanium dioxide and other metal oxides could split water when illuminated, but inefficiently, requiring UV light and suffering from rapid recombination of the generated charges. Nanostructuring helped, creating junctions and surface states that improved charge separation. Doping with other elements shifted the absorption into the visible spectrum, yet the efficiency remained too low for practical hydrogen production. The goal tantalized, but stayed just out of reach. Environmental remediation continued to find applications for nanomaterials, though not always as originally envisioned. Nanoparticulate zero-valent iron could indeed clean contaminated groundwater, but it tended to aggregate, to lose reactivity, to be immobilized by the soil matrix. Success required careful site characterization and often repeated injections. Photocatalytic titanium dioxide could break down pollutants but needed UV light and worked slowly. Real-world conditions were messier than laboratory demonstrations, yet in specific contexts, for specific contaminants, the approaches proved viable. Air filtration advanced through nanofiber materials. electrospun polymers creating webs with fiber diameters in the hundreds of nanometers. These filters could capture particles with high efficiency while maintaining low pressure drop, allowing air to flow through easily. They appeared in respirators, in HVAC systems, in cleanroom applications, a practical implementation of nanoscale structure for macroscale benefit. The conversation around safety evolved. Early fears of wholesale catastrophe faded, replaced by more nuanced concern about specific materials in specific contexts. Carbon nanotubes in aerosolized form raised legitimate questions about pulmonary exposure, but embedded in composites they posed minimal risk. Silver nanoparticles released from textiles into waterways could affect aquatic organisms, but the concentrations and ecological impacts required careful study. Zinc oxide and titanium dioxide in sunscreens were extensively tested and generally found safe, though concerns lingered about environmental accumulation. Regulatory approaches varied by region. Europe adopted a precautionary stance, requiring nanomaterials to be specifically assessed, even if the bulk form was approved. Labeling requirements appeared for cosmetics and food containing nanomaterials. The United States took a more case-by-case approach. Existing regulations for chemicals were applied, but with guidance acknowledging nanoscale specificity. Industry developed voluntary reporting schemes, sharing information about nanomaterial use and safety testing. The toxicology research deepened in sophistication, moving beyond simple cell viability assays to mechanism-based understanding. How did nanoparticles interact with proteins, with cell membranes, with organelles? What determined whether they would be toxic or benign? Shape mattered, surface charge mattered, coating mattered. Even the synthesis method could leave residues that affected biological response. The field learned to control these variables, to design for safety as well as function. Public engagement efforts attempted to demystify nanotechnology. Science museums created exhibits. Educational programs brought nanoscience into classrooms. Researchers participated in dialogue with communities and stakeholders. The goal was informed discussion rather than either uncritical enthusiasm or reflexive fear, though achieving that balance proved difficult. The technical complexity made simple explanations challenging, and the absence of dramatic incidents meant public attention remained limited. Investment patterns shifted. The initial wave of venture capital that had flowed into nanotechnology startups in the early 2000s began to ebb as returns proved slower than anticipated. Some companies succeeded, creating viable businesses in specialty materials, in coatings, in composites. Others pivoted or folded. The timeline for commercialization stretched longer than optimistic projections had suggested, but patient capital and strategic partnerships kept development moving forward. Academic research diversified, moving beyond the initial gold rush mentality where every department wanted a nanotechnology center, toward more focused investigations of specific questions. How to control chirality in carbon nanotubes to separate metallic from semiconducting types. How to scale up production of graphene while maintaining quality. How to stabilize perovskites for long-term operation. How to deliver RNA therapeutics using lipid nanoparticles. Each question narrow but important, each contributing to the larger edifice of understanding. Interdisciplinary collaboration became not just encouraged, but essential. No single discipline could address the complexity of nanoscale systems. Physicists brought understanding of quantum mechanics and solid-state phenomena. Chemists contributed synthesis expertise and surface chemistry knowledge. Biologists understood cellular interactions and immune responses. Engineers translated insights into manufacturable processes and scalable designs. The boundaries between fields blurred. Researchers became fluent in multiple languages, comfortable moving between quantum mechanics and cell biology, between molecular dynamics, simulations, and clinical trials. And as the field matured, as the initial excitement settled into sustained effort, a different kind of appreciation emerged, not for revolutionary transformation arriving suddenly, but for the quiet power of incremental improvement, the accumulated benefit of countless small advances, materials a bit stronger, processes a bit more efficient, devices a bit more capable, each change modest, but compounding over time into substantial progress. The story of nanotechnology was revealing itself to be not a single dramatic breakthrough, but a gradual weaving of capability, a patient accumulation of knowledge and technique, a deepening relationship between human intention and atomic reality. And in this slower, steadier unfolding, there was perhaps something more profound than the flash of revolution, something that spoke to the nature of understanding itself, to the way insight is built, layer upon layer, atom upon atom, until the invisible becomes visible and the impossible becomes routine. The work continued in laboratories that hummed with controlled precision, in manufacturing facilities where nanomaterials were produced by the ton, in hospitals where nanoparticles drugs circulated through patients' veins, in the silicon chips processing these very words. Nanotechnology had become infrastructure, had become the substrate on which other advances were built, and in that transformation from frontier to foundation, it had succeeded in ways both quieter and more lasting than the early visions had imagined. To understand nanotechnology at its most profound level is to understand something about the nature of reality itself, about the way matter organizes, the way complexity emerges from simplicity, the way the universe builds elaborate structures from elementary components. At the nanoscale, the distinction between living and non-living begins to blur. A virus, after all, is a nanoscale object, neither fully alive nor entirely inert, a protein shell containing genetic instructions, somewhere between chemistry and biology. And when scientists build nanoparticles that carry genetic material into cells, that recognize molecular signatures and respond, that self-assemble and perform functions, they are creating objects that occupy the same ambiguous territory, molecular machines that echo life's strategies without being alive. The cell itself is the master nanotechnologist. Every moment, in every living organism, molecular machines are at work. Ribosomes translate genetic code into proteins, adding amino acids one at a time with atomic precision. Motor proteins walk along cytoskeletal tracks, carrying cargo through the cellular interior, each step powered by the hydrolysis of ATP, each movement the result of conformational changes measured in nanometers. Ion channels open and close, creating electrical signals through selective passage of atoms, sodium, potassium, calcium, each recognized and transported with exquisite specificity. When human-designed nanotechnology works, it does so by learning from these biological examples, by mimicking the strategies that evolution discovered, self-assembly, where components find each other and organize spontaneously, driven by thermodynamics, by the tendency of systems to minimize free energy. DNA, origami, folds nucleic acids into precise shapes through Watson-Crick base pairing, each adenine finding its thymine, each guanine finding its cytosine, creating scaffolds and structures with nanometer resolution, not through external manipulation but through internal instruction, information encoded in sequence becoming manifest in form. Proteins fold through similar principles, a chain of amino acids collapsing into a unique three-dimensional structure, guided by hydrophobic and hydrophilic interactions, by hydrogen bonds and disulfide bridges, by the fundamental forces that operate at the nanoscale. And when that folding goes wrong, when proteins misfold and aggregate, diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's result. Plaques and tangles at the nanoscale, creating dysfunction at the scale of organs and organisms. Another reminder that size does not determine significance. There is something almost meditative in contemplating these processes, the constant molecular dance, the thermal fluctuations that keep everything in motion, the Brownian jitter, that at the nanoscale is not a disturbance, but a fundamental aspect of existence. Particles diffusing through solution, not by swimming, but by being jostled, buffeted by collisions with water molecules, millions of impacts per second, creating a random walk that nevertheless leads to mixing, to equilibration, to the spread of molecules through space. Nanotechnology harnesses these fluctuations, uses randomness productively. Nanoparticles find their targets not through directed movement but through diffusion and recognition. Billions of particles released into the bloodstream, each one wandering, each collision a chance for recognition, for binding, and the specificity comes not from guidance but from the shape of molecules, from the lock and key fit of receptor and ligand, from the same principles that govern enzyme-substrate interactions and antibody-antigen recognition. The colors of nanomaterials arise from a quantum confinement, from the fact that electrons trapped in spaces comparable to their wavelength behave differently, their energy levels discretize, and the gaps between those levels determine which photons they absorb and emit. Quantum dots glow in colors tuned by their size. Smaller dots emit blue light, larger ones red, because the confinement is stronger or weaker, the same material, the same composition, but different colors purely from geometry, from the prison of dimension. Gold nanoparticles display their reds and purples through plasmon resonance, collective oscillations of surface electrons. Driven by the electromagnetic field of light, the frequency of oscillation depends on size and shape. On the dielectric environment, spheres resonate at different wavelengths than rods. Particles close together couple their plasmons, shifting the resonance again. This is how ancient artisans created the Lycurgus cup, a Roman glass that appears jade green in reflected light but ruby red when illuminated from within. Gold nanoparticles suspended in glass, creating color through nanoscale structures centuries before anyone understood the mechanism. The strength of materials at the nanoscale often approaches theoretical limits because defects, the dislocations and grain boundaries that allow materials to deform, become less probable in smaller volumes. A carbon nanotube is essentially a perfect crystal, every atom bonded correctly, and so its strength reflects the strength of a carbon-carbon bonds themselves. not weakened by flaws. This is why materials that are brittle in bulk can be flexible at the nanoscale. Why whiskers and nanowires can bend and recover, sustaining strains that would shatter larger structures. Surface energy dominates at small sizes because the ratio of surface atoms to interior atoms grows. A nanoparticle of 10 nanometers diameter might have half its atoms at the surface, each one experiencing incomplete bonding, dangling bonds reaching into empty space. This creates reactivity, a driving force for aggregation, for coating, for interaction with the environment. It is why nanoparticles must be stabilized, protected, given shells or surface layers that satisfy those dangling bonds and prevent unwanted reactions. Heat flows differently. Electrons behave quantum mechanically, tunneling through barriers, existing in superpositions, entangling across distances. The nanoscale is where the classical world transitions to the quantum, where everyday intuition fails and stranger rules apply. And learning to work in this regime requires not just new techniques, but new ways of thinking. Comfort with probability rather than certainty, with wave-particle duality, with the observer effect where measurement itself changes what is measured. There is humility in this, recognition that control at the nanoscale is always partial, always negotiated with the laws of physics, always a conversation between intention and possibility. Researchers propose, nature disposes, and the wisdom lies in learning to listen, to understand what the system wants to do, what configurations are favorable, what processes will proceed spontaneously, and then aligning human goals with those natural tendencies rather than fighting against them. And so the story of nanotechnology returns to where it began, to the invisible realm that underlies all visible things, to the atomic foundations of matter and the molecular machinery of life, to the space where human ingenuity meets fundamental law and creates something new from ancient elements. The work continues, though perhaps now with different expectations, with patience for the long development cycles that real innovation requires, with acceptance that transformation comes through accumulation rather than revolution, that each small advance in understanding, each improved synthesis, each optimized formulation contributes to a larger progression that may only become clear in retrospect. In laboratories around the world, at this very moment, researchers are positioning atoms, synthesizing molecules, characterizing structures, testing materials, each one adding their thread to a tapestry whose full pattern remains incomplete, whose ultimate form cannot yet be known. Because nanotechnology is not a fixed destination, but an ongoing exploration, a continuous deepening of the relationship between human capacity and natural possibility. The technologies that emerge from this work blend into daily life, becoming transparent through familiarity. The smartphone in a pocket contains more nanotechnology than could have been imagined just decades ago. From the nanoscale transistors in its processor to the quantum dots in its display, from the lithium-ion battery with its nanostructured electrodes to the sensors that detect motion and orientation through nanoscale mechanical elements, all of it invisible, all of it essential. In hospitals, nanoparticles circulate through patients' blood, seeking tumors, delivering drugs, improving outcomes in ways both measurable and meaningful. The revolution is quiet, incremental, but no less real for its subtlety. Each life extended, each side effect reduced, each diagnosis made earlier accumulating into substantial benefit. The environmental applications proceed. Nanofiltration membranes purifying water, photocatalytic surfaces breaking down pollutants. Though the grand visions of planetary remediation have given way to more modest but achievable goals, targeted interventions, specific solutions to specific problems, progress measured in increments rather than transformations, and the fundamental research deepens because there is always more to understand, more phenomena to explore at the boundary between classical and quantum, between order and chaos, between the designed and the emergent, each answer revealing new questions, each solved problem exposing further complexity. The work is inexhaustible because nature's creativity at the nanoscale appears unlimited. Perhaps this is the ultimate lesson of nanotechnology, that smallness contains multitudes, that the invisible world is as rich and intricate as any cosmos, that there is no scale at which reality becomes simple, only scales at which different principles dominate, different symmetries emerge, different possibilities open. The story does not end, it only pauses, like a conversation interrupted but not concluded, like a question asked but not fully answered. Because nanotechnology is still unfolding, still revealing itself, still teaching those who work with it about the nature of matter, about the art of precision, about what becomes possible when human intention engages with atomic reality. In the quiet of clean rooms, in the hum of instruments measuring the unmeasurable, in the glow of monitors displaying structures too small for any eye to see, the work continues, patient, methodical, incremental, building the future atom by atom, molecule by molecule, one careful placement at a time. And there is beauty in this, in the dedication to understanding, in the persistence required to work at scales where every environmental vibration matters, where contamination arrives unseen, where success demands not just knowledge but craft, not just theory but touch, the ability to sense through instruments, to feel through data, to know when the system is behaving as it should. The nanoscale world persists in its dance, atoms oscillating, electrons tunneling, molecules diffusing, all the ceaseless motion of matter at its most fundamental level, indifferent to human observation, following rules that existed long before consciousness arose to study them, rules that will continue long after, eternal, patient, waiting to be understood a little more deeply, used a little more wisely, appreciated a little more fully, and in that appreciation, in that wonder at the complexity hidden in simplicity, at the order emerging from chaos, at the way structure at the smallest scales creates properties at larger ones, there is a kind of peace, the peace of understanding, and however partial, however incomplete, that the universe makes sense, that there are patterns to discover, principles to learn, beauty to witness, even in the realm of the infinitesimal. The story fades, as all stories must, but the reality it describes continues invisible, essential, the nanoscale foundation on which everything else is built, atoms and molecules, assembling, interacting, creating, the endless dance of matter at the edge of perception, at the heart of everything.